So this next session is really interesting, to say the least. There'll be a lot of sort of scientific explanation and a lot of really wonderful and informative information around the application and use of and historical use of psychedelic medicine for different reasons. And we'll be joined with, why don't we just have everyone on the panel come up now, and in that way you all can come and be together here. Do you know who you are? So if I mispronounce someone's name, please forgive me in advance. But we have a very interesting group. I'm going to let everyone really introduce themselves and tell you about who they are and what they do, because I'm sure in their presentations they'll be much more thorough in that explanation, and for all of you to have a discovery. But very quickly, what I would like everyone just to do is just say your name. We'll share the microphones. Is just to say your name and a short title of what you do.
Okay, hello. I'm Christina Dalla in Greek. I'm a pharmacologist and a psychopharmacologist, experimental mainly, and I'm also president of the Hellenic Brain Council and member of the European Brain Foundation. And you will see about my work later. Thank you.
Well, my name is Zephyros Kafkalides, and I'm the son of psychiatrist Athanassios Kafkalides, who actually worked in the field of psychedelics during the 50s and 60s, and I would like to present his main point, his research main points.
My name is Tony Bossis. I'm a professor at NYU. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've spent the last 15, 20 years working with the psychedelic psilocybin from the so-called magic mushrooms for two primary reasons: to help us die better and address that awful suffering that could accompany the end of life, and also to better understand consciousness, meaning, and spirituality.
And I am Fred Barrett. I'm a faculty member in the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. I'm also the director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, whereas, along with colleagues like Tony, we are exploring the edges of the indication space of what psychedelics may be able to do in terms of helping us to heal and to grow as humans.
And for those of you who don't know, I'm Gina Belafonte, and I don't know very much about psychedelics other than the ones that I've taken. And I'm always interested in leaning into learning and deepening understanding. And this is a very big movement currently, talking about zeitgeist in the United States. Most recently, I came from a conference in Denver where there was close to 12,000 people that gathered around the discussions and conversations around psychedelic medicine, and also other ways in which to have psychedelic experiences other than through taking the medicine. But what I'd like to do in the tradition of Greece is to start with the history that we have on this panel. And Zephyros, could you please take the podium and tell us a bit about Athanassios, your father, and his work and discoveries.
Hello? Yes. Well, when Albert Hofmann visited Eleusis on the 15th of February 2000, he made the following statement. Today, he said, only psychiatrists and psychologists would be qualified to replace the Eleusinian priests on the path to an enlightening experience. These psychiatrists and psychologists must become the shamans of our times. Then I think we will be ready to move towards this kind of psychopharmacopoeia. Now then, we know all of us actually that the decade of the 50s and 60s is remembered for music and science and philosophy, from Albert Hoffman, Timothy Leary, Aldous Huxley, to the actually the computer mouse and deep ecology. There is a lot in the late 20th century zeitgeist that is acid-driven. I would like, however, to say, because I have 15 minutes only, to read you an article from the Time magazine of 2010. On the 4th of October 2010, Time magazine came out with a cover headline, "How the First 9 Months Shaped the Rest of Your Life, the New Science of Embryonic Origins." Catherine Monk, an assistant professor of psychiatry at Columbia University, has proposed an even more surprising suggestion, that a pregnant woman's mental state can shape the psyche of her offspring. Research shows that even before birth, the mother's mood can affect the child's development, says Monk. Can maternal mood be transmitted to the fetus? If so, what is the mode of transmission? And how do such moods affect fetal development? These are new questions that need to be asked, she writes. We are still thinking about how to get the embryos to answer. Well, the embryo's answer was 50 years in advance of Catherine Monk's question. Their answer is detailed in Stanislav Grof's work, The Realms of Human Unconscious, Observations of LSD Research, edition 1975. Athanassios Kafkalides' treatise, The Knowledge of the Womb, Autosagnosia with Psychedelic Drugs, 1975 as well. And Frank Lake's, an English psychiatrist, entitled his work, The First Trimester. Those three psychiatrists, without knowing each other, using the same substance, that means LSD, Sandoz, and later psilocybin and ketamine, as means for more effective psychotherapy in different countries during the same period, following different methodologies, arrived at the same basic conclusion. That is to say, the fetus is aware of its mother's emotions, and the quality of its intrauterine life and expulsion birth is directly related to the psychological state of the future adult. They came to this conclusion on the basis of general description of their subjects under LSD. Any experience of the past, sensorial, emotional, intellectual, and so forth, may be relived vividly under LSD, psilocybin, or ketamine. Characteristic and very striking is the emotional and physical synchronization which accompanies the revival of childhood, infancy, and fetal life. That is, the person feels that his body has assumed the dimensions it had at the time of the revival event, and he relieves the emotions of that period. In the years that followed, more psychiatrists and researchers came to the same conclusion. I mentioned the works of Ludwig Janus of Heidelberg and Thomas Verney of Toronto. So Grof, Lake, and Kafkalides, although they assert the crucial importance of the rejective quality of prenatal and perinatal experiences as the main cause of mental disorders, differ from each other in terms of methodology and theoretical interpretations. According to Stanislav Grof, the emotional and psychosomatic disorders have a multi-leveled, multi-dimensional structure with important additional roots on the vital threat and agony of the birth trauma. Actually, he confirms the theoretical views of Otto Rank, who published his well-known book, The Trauma of Birth, in 1924. Frank Lake, the English psychiatrist, stresses the importance on the first trimester following conception and the unbearable transmarginal pain experienced by the rejected fetus in the womb. He is persuaded that his clinical finding, based on the subjective experience of his patients, constitutes the etiology of mental illness. He concludes that if we wish to prevent this extensive pathology, we must provide a fetal existence bathed in maternal peacefulness and even delight, where now the pathology is a byproduct of the mother's severe distress. Kafkalides claims that the rejecting quality of the womb superpower in toto and the intrauterine or expulsion birth primitive terror felt by some of his patients was the main cause of their mental disorders. Those findings, actually, it's natural, they lead into a kind of philosophical and scientific revolution. The tabula rasa principle is overturned in a way, because the tabula rasa principle, since Aristotle to Locke and from Locke to Freud, we are born as white paper without any characters. That means there is no consciousness. Consciousness is created at the moment of birth. This is the main idea since Aristotle to Freud. Here we have a new paradigm. As well, psychedelic drugs, they extend the subconscious into infinity. And a new field of understanding of the causes of depression is being opened up to scientific research. Now, I would like to read you a passage of the research program of Kafkalides. What impressed him in the cases between October 1960 and November 1965, he treated them with LSD 25 some dose, was the extremely vivid revivals of both pleasant and unpleasant events from infancy and early childhood. Let's follow his thoughts. I must admit, he writes, that I viewed these descriptions with great skepticism and doubt. The methodology for medical study, which I had learned as a student, the term hallucinogenic drug, the term used then for psychedelic drugs, inhibited my thinking. I didn't allow myself to accept most of the descriptions made by my patients as being true ones which revealed aspects of their unconscious that were unknown and or unacceptable to traditional psychiatry, psychoanalysis, and behaviorism. On the 5th of October 1965, a very strange thing took place. Kafkalides writes, I had a very strong shock one day in December 1965 when I realized that my absence from the room where the session was held had helped one of my patients to reach very deep levels of the unconscious. At 8:30 a.m. that day, I had administered 100 micrograms of Delicid intramuscularly to a man 30 years old. It was his 4th session with LSD. The hours went by and the patient was proceeding so satisfactory with realizations that I didn't have the heart to break off the session as I usually did at the end of 8 hours. It was about 7:30 p.m. that evening when I communicated with him again, and you can understand my surprise and shock when he said that during my absence, he had felt his body shrink to the size of a fetus, while at the same time, he was flooded with a feeling of ineffable serenity because the womb, his mother, had welcomed him. In 1966, and for quite some time, Kafkalides felt certain that during fetal life, everyone experiences the perfect serenity provided by the safe intrauterine environment. This attitude remained for some time parallel to the terrifying experience of expulsion birth felt under LSD and psilocybin. Intrauterine safety, the trauma of birth, desire to return to the safe womb either through sexual activity or any other substitute. This was the theoretical concept of the day. Now, it is easy to understand, writes Kafkalides, that I had more or less unconsciously imposed this pattern on each new case until one fine morning there was a new upheaval, which showed me that I, all by myself, had put the blinders back on. That day, during a session, a 20-year-old girl told me in a voice filled with anxiety and fear, "I feel that I'm in the womb. I am afraid. I am terribly afraid." And in a most unprofessional way, I replied, "But how can you be in the safe womb and feel afraid?" Her answer was an angry one. "And how can you know that I was safe in the womb?"
Zephyros, this is very interesting and very incredible information. I would love if you could finish this thought.
Yes.
And then, because I do want to make
actually, there were two stages, the welcoming womb and the rejecting womb through under sessions of LSD sessions. Now, the only thing I would like to read you is the revival of experiences of intrauterine life. It's 2 minutes.
Yes.
The treatise of Kafkalides was based on 16 cases, which are mentioned, and those cases claim that during their fetal life they were conscious of their existence in the following sense. All the fetuses felt themselves to be surrounded by something colossal which aroused in them either blissful serenity or chaotic terror. This was the entourage of the womb, the first external environment. Thus, the 16 identified the colossal thing, as we said, as the womb. The chaotic intrauterine terror felt by some of the 16 cases was caused by the emotional disturbance of the woman in whose womb they were developing. And I read you, what are those emotional disturbances? First, the pregnant woman's emotional rejection of the sex of the fetus. Second, the pregnant woman's emotional rejection of the fetal presence. Third, the fear, anxiety, or terror of the pregnant woman caused by factors unrelated to the fetus within her. Example, sudden bad news, social and environmental stresses, and so on and so forth. And finally, chaotic terror was felt by some of the 16 during the revival of their expulsion birth. And finishing, I would like to read you my thoughts about all that. I would like to conclude my communiqué with the following thoughts. What became clear to us during our study, not only Kafkalides' work, but Stanislas Grof, Frank Lake's work, Ludwig Janus, and others. What became clear to us during our study is that when the researcher psychotherapist accepts and respects above all the subjective reality of his patient, that is to say, the individual nature of the psychic world, trying to intervene as little as possible with his own interpretations or imposing explanatory models whatsoever, then he gets closer to the being of things and becomes more objective. And this is an oxymoron. Being more objective in his scientific judgment by accepting the subjectivity. As long as this fundamental change in methodology is not embraced by the mainstream scientific community, the prenatal findings will continue to be considered as unscientific. And the work of Kafkalides, Grof, Lake, and others, as well as that of Lake, as an investigation from a pure hypothesis, a method which practices systematically what the Eleusis forbids on principle. Argument from an unasserted premise. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. And again, we hear the word zeitgeist and how different therapists who didn't know each other were doing this work simultaneously, which is really incredible. Thank you. Thank you again. I'm going to ask Andonis to take the podium. We'll go from birth straight to death. You guys decide.
He's going to lay a foundation. It's better if you go. Okay. As planned. Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Fred, take the stage, and you know better. I'm happy to follow your lead.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Gina, and thank you so much, Zephyros, for that kind of introduction from early stages. Actually, do we have the controller for the slides? Okay. So what I want to do now is kind of set the stage, give kind of an introduction and a foundation for the modern scientific study of psychedelics that I then will believe Dr. Bossis will build upon. And I thank you for giving this introduction because I think knowing where this started will also help us understand where it is now and then where we're going in the future. I'm going to give you a crash course as best I can in the recent science of psychedelic drugs, but I want to kind of frame this in just a little bit by starting with, well, what are psychedelic drugs? And when you look in the dictionary, you will find phrases such as sensory perception, perceptual distortions, maybe big feelings, and these things may be true sometimes. They're not always true during the acute effects of a psychedelic drug. But I think we can go a little deeper than that. The word psychedelic itself was first coined by a British psychiatrist who was expatriated to Canada, Humphrey Osmond, and he was one of the first individuals to administer LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, to patients in a clinic for what was called at the time alcoholism. Humphrey Osmond himself ingested LSD to figure out how it worked and what did it feel like, and also because he thought understanding the effects of LSD would help him as a clinician to understand how it may be useful in the clinic. He was also known for sharing psychedelics with his colleagues. He shared mescaline with, Aldous Huxley, thank you very much, who went on to pen the famous Doors of Perception. Humphrey Osmond, from his experiences, coined this term psychedelic from the roots psyche, meaning mind, and delos, meaning to manifest. And so he felt that psychedelics manifested something about the mind that the experiencer may not have had access to in normal waking consciousness. And lots of drugs now, people try to call them psychedelic. If you take that mind manifesting definition to its most generous interpretation, I think the Cafe Fredo that I had this morning was mind manifesting, right? But maybe wasn't quite what Humphrey Osmond was talking about. The exact drugs that fall under the classic definition include LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, which was founded in a laboratory, but also psilocybin, which comes from literally hundreds of species of mushroom that grow around the world. These are mushrooms that not only occur on almost every continent naturally, but they've, through archaeological evidence, been suggested to have been used for thousands of years in various ceremonial ritual contexts. There are cave drawings, ancient cave drawings of a man covered in mushrooms. There are mushroom statues that are thought to have religious or kind of ritual purpose that have been unearthed at various sites. And also then we have peyote or mescaline, which comes from psychoactive cacti, and we have ayahuasca, which is one of many different kind of plant sources of classic psychedelic drugs. There are thousands of plant sources of psychedelic drugs that naturally occur in the world. To say that psychedelics have evolved or have existed for as long as we have, I think that's a pretty safe statement. But we haven't known about psychedelics clearly and concretely in society until, at least in Western society, for sure, until the late 1900s. LSD was first synthesized by Albert Hofmann in Sandoz laboratory in Switzerland in 1938, but he didn't claim to have discovered its effects on the mind until 1943. Not too long after that, Gordon Wasson took a trip to Mexico, and in the mountains of Oaxaca found Maria Sabina and a group of people who were using mushrooms, ceremonially, and he brought that back. He actually gave spores of these mushrooms to Albert Hoffman, who cultivated and then identified psilocybin as the active compound. So essentially, since the 50s, a ton of research was conducted, both in the clinic, in research laboratories, as well as by governmental agencies. Tens of thousands of people, at least, across this time were given LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, other drugs in the clinic and in a research context. All of this came to a crashing halt in 1971 with the passage of the Controlled Substances Act in the United States, and then international treaties were formed and agreed upon that essentially put these drugs into a status supposedly that they are very toxic, highly addictive, and have no known use medically. And that's where they stayed until more recently. There were a couple of studies that were conducted in the 1990s with humans in Switzerland. There was a study conducted in New Mexico in 1994 with dimethyltryptamine, but it wasn't until a paper was published in 2006 that things really captured our attention again. This was a study published in 2006 by my mentor at Hopkins, Roland Griffiths, who published a study in healthy individuals demonstrating not only could you safely administer psilocybin in a research context in a controlled setting, but also that in otherwise healthy individuals, these experiences that people encountered could have prolonged positive benefit. From this, a lot of people credit this as kind of reigniting our interest in psychedelics, and from there, a number of studies were conducted, not in healthy people only, but also in clinical populations. So these are graphs from a study that was conducted at Johns Hopkins, and also another study in parallel at New York University with Dr. Bossis and colleagues, showing that in patients who had a late-stage cancer diagnosis, a carefully controlled administration of psilocybin under supportive settings could essentially, treat the depression and anxiety. If you've ever known someone who has had a late-stage cancer diagnosis, the existential threat that they encounter during that time can be the most difficult thing to treat other than the actual cancer itself. And Tony will get into this, so I'm not going to get into this. But essentially we saw rapid and sustained reduction in depression and anxiety, among other things. From there, we began to study mood disorders more generally, not just depression in patients with cancer, but depression in people who were depressed. At Hopkins, we published the first randomized control trial demonstrating that 1 or 2 doses of psilocybin administered to patients who were moderately to severely depressed, they would be in remission for at least a year after these 2 pills were ingested. Another study that was conducted more recently in patients with treatment-resistant depression shows, all the way out to the left is how depressed people were when they started the study. This was a multinational clinical trial conducted in over 200 individuals, and they showed with a high dose of psilocybin, the blue line at the bottom shows a rapid reduction in depression severity, which was sustained for at least 12 weeks. I know they're looking longer, but we haven't gotten there yet. This showed not only in patients who were depressed, but patients who had repeatedly failed traditional interventions to treat their depression. They saw response and therapeutic response with psilocybin, and even compared. So our colleagues at Imperial College London demonstrated, compared to escitalopram, which is a traditional first-line therapy, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, an SSRI. It's a first-line therapy for depression. You take 1 pill once a day for the duration of the time that you need it. Compared to escitalopram, psilocybin did at least as good. 2 doses of psilocybin, at least as good as the standard of care that a patient would have to take for the rest of their lives, possibly. And this chart on the left shows, the blue line is how people responded in terms of antidepressant effect for escitalopram, and the red line is psilocybin. It's not statistically significantly different, but this other plot on the left, on the right, you don't have to deeply understand it except to see the green lines are all to the left. That shows on a number of different effects: anhedonia, work life and social function, flourishing, well-being, even suicidality. People were having a better response under psilocybin than they did under the standard of care. And so these effects are remarkable. These are one of the things that is getting everybody so excited about psychedelic therapies. We haven't had a real true revolution or intervention in psychiatry evolve in at least the past 40 or 50 years, and this may be that. Not only patients who are suffering from mood disorders, but those who are suffering from substance use disorders. On the left, we have a plot of effects in patients who are suffering from tobacco use disorder, one of the leading causes of death in the US, if not worldwide. After 2 or 3 doses of psilocybin, patients were biologically verified abstinent nicotine for at least 6 months out to a year and a half afterwards. Over 80% of people in the study were abstinent after 2 or 3 pills ingested. And the gold standard for treating tobacco use disorder is varenicline or Chantix. It's the patch, and you at best expect 25 to 30% of people to respond to that. Also, our colleagues at NYU, led by Michael Bogenschutz, showed a rapid and sustained reduction in drinking in patients suffering from alcohol use disorder. So there's a lot going on here, and it's intriguing that this intervention may not only treat patients with depression, but may treat patients with many other disorders, some related to existential threat, which again, Tony will get into later. We're not only finding these treatment effects behaviorally, but we're finding evidence in the brain that we're changing the flexibility of the brain. These are, making the brain a little more flexible. These are observed alongside of other effects that suggest that psychedelics increase what we call cognitive flexibility, or your capacity to think differently, to think flexibly about yourself, your place in the world, and your life situation. It may be that psychedelics are allowing us that greater capacity to rethink ourselves, and we're seeing that in behavior, we're seeing it in brain function, and people are also seeing these in animal studies. So on the left is a figure from a study published in 2018 suggesting that psychedelics may allow the brain to essentially form new synapses, or in stressed brains, we have synapses. These are the connections between neurons that allow for firing and communication between regions of the brain. When you're stressed, when you're anxious, when you're depressed, when you're suffering from a psychiatric disorder, oftentimes these synapses die back. And we may have evidence now that psilocybin and other related compounds can help you to regrow those connections, put back those connections that were essentially brought on by stress or anxiety or psychosis or some other thing. This is one finding. Another finding very recently from Gouldolan at Hopkins suggests that not only is there neuroplasticity, think of the brain becoming a little more malleable like plastic and you can mold it into a different shape. She's also showing that biologically speaking, we as a species and many other species have developmental windows of learning. You may have heard that if you don't learn a language by the age of 7 or 8 years old, you may have lost the opportunity to be able to hear that language. I am never going to learn Cantonese or Mandarin, and I will never be able to hear it the way a natural speaker does, and I will never be able to produce it. I've missed that critical window in my development that would allow me to hear and then produce the phonemes that are natural to Cantonese, Mandarin, so many other languages, probably Greek, I'm sure. And I keep telling everybody, your English is so much better than my Greek, so thank you for speaking English to me. Gould shows evidence that psychedelics may reopen these windows, at least for social reward learning. Reopening these windows in the brain is remarkable and maybe one of the most impactful findings in psychedelics to date. But I want to kind of think about, not only has this had a huge impact on the science, and the blue lines are, papers that have been published that mention psilocybin, and you see them skyrocketing. On the right, we see clinical trials that are approved and listed on a government website, and they're skyrocketing as well over time. People are getting much more interested in this, but not only have best-selling books been published, Netflix documentaries, coverage in all of the major news outlets in the world, even on Oprah. Our founding Senator Director Roland Griffiths was on Oprah very recently. But there's one more layer to this that I want to unpack and peel back for you. And it's not just that these drugs can have this effect, but how are they having this effect? What's at the core of this effect? And it's something that sometimes we struggle to describe with scientific terms and in scientific language, but it's the notion of a mystical experience. What is a mystical experience? Well, I'll share with you a quote from Alan Watts. They may be these peculiar states of consciousness in which the individual discovers himself to be one continuous process with God, the universe, the ground of being, whatever name she may use by cultural conditioning or personal preference for the ultimate and eternal reality. The mystical experience is something that has been discussed in the psychology of religion, the philosophy of religion. One of the first mentions in modern literature is in a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience by the famous psychologist William James, where he devoted an entire chapter to these experiences. More recently, in 1960, a philosopher of religion, Walter Stace, had gone through and published an entire book on his scholarship, reading all of the writings, ancient and modern literature that he could get his hands on, trying to find these mystical experiences, and then figure out what's common among them. And what he found was that these mystical experiences had a bit of a common core. I'll go backwards through this list. Transcendence of space and time. When people have these mystical experiences, time and space seem to fall back and you don't experience them as you normally do. Paradoxicality, you can hold two very paradoxical ideas in mind at the same time. Deeply felt positive mood, noetic quality, or a sense of knowing or experiencing something that's real to a fundamental level, maybe even to more real than you normally experience real life being. Sacredness, a feeling of unity or a breakdown of the boundaries between self and other. Maybe you feel at one with yourself, with the room, with the people around you, or the world, or the universe. And wrapped up in this, you can imagine some ineffability, an inability to put these experiences into words in a way that communicates them. I've as a researcher, only guided about 40 psychedelic intervention sessions, so I've only sat in the room with about 40 people. But when you're preparing people for these experiences, you have to do your best to describe the ineffable. And what I'll often say is, have you been a parent or lost a loved one? And even if you haven't experienced either of those things, people can usually kind of grasp that that's a big deal. And both of those things. And they're fundamentally human experiences. And also, especially if you've experienced those things, you'll know that it's impossible to communicate the felt sense of being a parent or losing a close loved one. And that's kind of what psychedelic experiences are like, especially these mystical experiences. Don't believe me, believe the words of someone who's never been coached and never been educated about the history or philosophy or literature on mystical experiences, but this was a participant in one of our psilocybin trials, and they said, describing the experience, it felt more real than reality I have experienced. It was familiar when I had felt before. It was when I surrendered that I felt like I let go. I was gone, or this earthly part of me was. It was in some sort of suspended animation awaiting my return. I was in the void. It had a strange and indescribable quality, and that there was nothing to it but this feeling of unconditional and undying love. It felt like my soul was basking in the feeling of this space. I have no idea how long this lasted. Time and space did not exist. It's actually brilliant and remarkable how well this individual described almost every point of the mystical experience. In their description, we tell people to go home, sleep, come back with a written description of what occurred to you, and we'll talk about it. And this was the core of their description. We're finding out not only do people have these experiences, but they may predict therapeutic outcomes. And Tony will get more into this as well. I want to see. I also want to just play a short video of someone describing their experience. So again, don't believe me. Hear it from the participants.
It was about a higher power, being in a place of infinite space, and just being there. It had nothing to do with my life at all during that period. What I came to find out is that as the drug wore off, my brain got more involved in the exercise and said, you need to think about this and that. You need to think about your father, your mother, or whatever. And those things happen, but in the most intense, the most glorious part of this trip was that it was none of that. It was only a connection to this thing or power that was out there, and it touched me, and it was incredible. And there's no way I can explain it other than that. It was unbelievable. It took my breath away. It became me. It has become me, to where when I tell you or anybody else who wants to listen, it just became part of me. That's the best way I think I can explain it. And that's what was really incredible about it. So there was an initiative to reach out to me and say, you know, I'm here, you know, I'm here, and it was a privilege.
So not only are those experiences possibly at the core of changing someone's mind, but they're not only limited to people who are suffering from cancer, people who are suffering from depression. Very reliably, people who enter our studies, whether healthy or not, come away with such a sense of a profound experience that we tried to come up with ways of really kind of making this concrete. How does this compare to other things you've experienced in your life? And reliably, people will say that these experiences are among the top 5 or single most personally meaningful and spiritually significant experiences of their entire lives. And the first couple studies that were run at Hopkins included people who were well-educated, well-off, had good jobs. Yes, I may have passed the bar. I may be a doctor. I may be my company, but I also had this experience on a couch in East Baltimore one time. And this is driving my life now in positive ways. I have a lot of other examples here, but I want to get to a little bit of the more of the context of what it is. I think that it's important to understand that this is not just a drug in, healing out type of thing. It's not like an antibiotic necessarily. In some ways, the experience is not just the drug. The experience is an entire package. These compounds are known to be relatively physiologically safe for most people. We go through a careful process to screen people who may have some underlying heart problems. We go through a careful process to screen people out who may have a family history of psychosis. Once people are carefully screened, then we prepare them. We meet with them for 6 to 8 hours before the drug administration session so that we get to know them and they get to know us. We go through a review of their life story. Who are you? Where did you come from? Tell me all of the good and the bad that occurred. And this goes a long way to building trust so that when they have these experiences, they trust the people in the room who are supporting them. We then have an experimental drug administration session. People will come in the morning, we'll administer a capsule. They will be supported and guided through that process all day with someone there holding, non-judgmental presence and empathy, and then they have their experience. And then it's important to understand that that's where the work begins. After these experiences, people come back for days, weeks, sometimes months to continue to interact with the study teams, the therapists, so that they can understand the experience they've had and place it in context in their lives and begin to move forward. I feel that there's a lot of attention paid to this experience itself, which is incredibly important, possibly fundamental to understanding consciousness. But just as important is the process that evolves after, where a person then has to figure out how to move forward. Nope, I don't want to. I think that's Tony's. Is that? Oh, is that mine? Oh, yeah. Okay. So I want to.
I was
finish with one more
greatly
video.
enjoying beautiful music, high quality, beautiful music playing in my ears, lying in the sofa, my 2 guides sitting there quietly, supportively. And what it led to was a reawakening what it felt like when my first daughter, Tanya, died. And the feelings just came flooding out. I was completely into the strongest sense of despair and loss that I had after she died. And I howled. And I felt comforted that my guides won't They won't come and comfort me. They won't stop me. They'll let me go into it. And I did. And that's sort of almost 30 years of not denial, but putting it down, suppressing how that felt. And that was very liberating. After that, the experience with the drug, it became even more potent. Everything was animate. Like sitting here, all us around us, it's animate. Celebrating being part of this incredible living experience that we have.
So I also don't want to leave you with the sense that these are all easy or positive experiences in the moment. People can experience just about the entire breadth of human emotion and feeling. Sometimes people go through these experiences feeling like they're losing their mind or they're even dying. And they don't die, let me be clear. You can come in contact with the strongest sense of feeling that you've ever encountered in your life, and that may be part of the medicine. That may be part of what some people need in order to confront and then move through the trauma that may have fueled their psychiatric illness, or come in contact with kind of the core of their being that will allow them to move forward and grow even if they're a healthy individual. It's important to understand how vulnerable people can be during these experiences, which is why it's very important to have a trained therapist to accompany them and help them work through it in a safe manner. But when that is done in a carefully controlled setting with properly trained individuals, it seems to literally change people's lives through changing their mind. I want to just also acknowledge the enormous team of people who I have the privilege of working with every day. And of course, Tony has a similar impressive team, and as do many of the centers that are cropping up in the country and around the world. That's all I had to share with you today. I want to see if I can pass this off to Tony.
Thank you so much for that. Before you leave the podium, and before we also welcome someone who is joining us through Zoom, I just want to ask a quick question of you, which is, so you have described like very personal, very curated experiences for people to go through a therapeutic process. Is there any data at all from all of our uncles, brothers, sisters, parents who in the 60s were doing a lot of psychedelic experimenting and drugs? Is there any data, like are they all good? Are they all like healthy, therapeutically sound individuals, or what about that?
It's very, very interesting and powerful question. So there, as I said, thousands and tens of thousands of people were administered psychedelics in clinical settings or research settings. Many of those studies or experiments didn't necessarily meet our modern standards for rigor and reproducibility in science. They give us clues, and some of these clues are the clues we're following up on now with more rigorous science. But it's also important to, acknowledge that, if you'll forgive me, plenty of people were tripping in the 60s and didn't stop being depressed and didn't stop smoking or, dealing with other issues. And intentionality, context, and framing, all we feel, and support play a big role. We do have surveys, online surveys of people who claim in the world that yes, they took LSD or they took psilocybin and they hadn't intended it. They were at a party or maybe a music conference, but music performance, but they did have these experiences, but far more people don't.
Thank you. Thank you again. All right, I just wanted to acknowledge, joining us from Zoom is Jules Peck, who's created Reworlding Fellowship in collaboration with Imperial College. So, hello. Hello there. People can see you. I don't know if you can see us or not, but I just wanted to acknowledge that you are with us and will also be speaking with us as we now transition next to hear from Adonis, I'm using your Greek name as you asked me to. Bossis, please take the podium, and you can begin to give us even more information and more understanding on the use therapeutically and otherwise, perhaps, of psychedelic medicine.
Great, thank you. Kalimera. Good morning. First, I want a big thank you to Alexandra and Mirato and the entire World Human Foundation for putting on this incredible event. Efkaristopoli. It's really important. And I have to say, it's a privilege to be here. I'm a very proud Greek American with my ancestry from Limnos. And so it's very poignant for me to come back to Greece, which I do often, but to speak out here at Elefsina about such an important topic that really has a deep relationship to the work I do. I'm going to speak twice today for about a half an hour now, and then come back later. I hope you stay around and show a little more scientific data and talk about a study we're doing with religious leaders, where we gave psilocybin to religious leaders to have them help us understand the incredible nature of the spiritual landscape. I want to thank Fred. That's a perfect foundation that Fred laid out about psychedelics. And I'm going to take it down to a more narrow, specific avenue and talk about the application of psychedelics for the treatment of existential and spiritual suffering that people may have at the end of life. We've been discussing many issues this week in this incredible zeitgeist we find ourselves in this world, and it's incredible what's going on. Threats to political systems, threats to the physical planet, threats to environment, economies. But it's precarious, but it's also promising as we begin to move into new areas of understanding. Technology is taking off, and who knows where that will go. But maybe we're at the cusp of hoping to explore, what is consciousness? We have no idea. Is consciousness generated by this incredible thing in our head, the brain, which is remarkable? Or is it more remarkable than that? Is consciousness somehow outside of biology in some way? We don't know. And one of those important themes to discuss in this incredible time we're in is death. And how do we die? We don't die well in America. I know we don't die well in Greece. And we don't die well in most countries. People die with, and I'll show you some information today on this, with profound depression, anxiety, hopelessness. And we need to cultivate a better relationship to death and dying. Death isn't the end of life, it's part of life. And we can die better than we are dying regarding the emotional and spiritual upheaval. And I'm convinced that psychedelics, one of the greatest gifts of these medicines, is the application for people who are dying to transform end-of-life suffering into a greater sense of meaning-making, gratitude, acceptance. It's hard to leave this incredible thing we have here. How lucky are we to be alive? How lucky are we to be here today? But it ends. And that's part of it. And we need to do better at helping people end. And what is death? What is death? All these drugs do is temporarily open the gates of perception, as Aldous Huxley said, and change our mind for a few hours into an incredibly larger landscape of consciousness, where insights and memories from that experience can change our lives. And that's really very important. 40 years ago, I became aware of psychedelics. I became aware of the incredible body of literature that came out of the 1950s and 60s. And then it was shut down for 30 years. And I knew back then I wanted to dedicate my life to it, but there really was no field at the time, in the early 1980s. But I got very lucky, and about 20 years ago, a few of us in America began this new research movement, colleagues at Johns Hopkins and elsewhere. And here we are. Psychedelics is really exploding. And while there's promise, there's also, we need to be cautious. And we'll talk about that today and later on as well, as we move forward. So with that, I want to speak a little bit about the end of life and consciousness and death. And I want to say one thing that I'm going to say hopefully a few times today. I've sat with many people. So I work in palliative care, people who are dying. And in our study and just in conventional palliative care, people say the most important thing, of course, was to love. Was I loved? Did I love? Could I have loved more? Forgiveness. These are the things that come up at the bedside. These are the things that come up in our trial. And these are the things that matter. So I'm going to walk through a somewhat quick, about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then I'll come back later on today. So we'll talk about end of life. We're going to talk about spirituality, meaning making a little bit now, maybe more later. Here, of course, we're at Eleusis, which was about life and death, was about this very topic. So we don't die well, as I said. We're getting better in America. I really want to, I'm proud of what's happened in America in the last 20 years. The palliative care movement, the hospice movement has just exploded. And in America now, every month is a bestseller on death and dying. There's movies, there's end-of-life doulas, there's death over dinners. There's all these incredible mind-raising conversations about how do we die better? How do we die better? These are just two op-eds. I realize I cut them out probably 15, 20 years ago, but they're still relevant today. There was a time in America we didn't talk about death even in medical school. It wasn't part of training. And I'm a Greek American with relatives in Greece that I've known for my entire life. I know it's not great here either. We just don't talk about it. And we have to talk about it. Ernest Becker, the great Ernest Becker, called it the final taboo. But it's time. It's part of the zeitgeist. And I think the pandemic pulled back the curtain on something we know. This is short, but it showed us suffering and death are right around the corner, and we have to enjoy our lives and transform ourselves as best we can. And suffering is always right there. We'll talk about that a little later on too. So for years, people have called for an improvement in how we die. If I take this, can I roam around? I can't see that. Good. So years ago, the Institute of Medicine in America said you have to improve how we treat people who are dying. And we're doing better. We are doing better. However, a recent study showed people are still dying with an increased prevalence of depression in America. And depression and hopelessness, which we're going to talk about, and I'm going to get to the psychedelics in a minute, but I want to talk about how we die, are strong desires for a hastened death. People who are depressed and hopeless have an increased chance of suicidal thinking and suicidal behavior. And if that's treated, that desire goes away. And I'm going to talk about something briefly today called demoralization syndrome. I won't go into it too deeply, but we have a new study starting where people who are demoralized have a high prevalence of suicidal thinking, and it's very hard to treat. Demoralization is a profound sense of hopelessness, meaninglessness, and existential distress. And it's been shown to be untreatable in part by medication and conventional psychotherapies. But the psychedelic experience, as we showed in a recent trial, was able to treat it because of this profound meaning-making transpersonal state. I'm going to skip through some of these slides, but just take my word for it. People who are depressed and hopeless have a higher prevalence of suicide. If that's treated, they have no desire for suicide. We can treat this at the end of life. Any palliative care workers here? Any people who work in palliative care? Kala, Anna, Theo? No, okay. Palliative care affirms life and regards dying as a normal process. It neither hastens nor postpones death. Now that second point is a bit controversial because in America now, I don't think in Greece, but in Canada, we have assisted in dying programs where it's legally allowed for physicians to assist people in dying. We can talk about that later, but it's controversial for a lot of important reasons. But we respect life and death, and we don't hasten or postpone death. It's about spirituality, and it's about life review. And we know from research that meaning making and spirituality can be a buffer against the suffering at the end of life. Who knows Viktor Frankl? Please, hands. The great Viktor Frankl, Holocaust survivor, went on to write an important book, Man's Search for Meaning, and developed a therapy called logotherapy, which you know what it means, from meaning, logos, meaning-making therapy. Viktor Frankl wrote, meaning can be found in life literally up to the last moment, up to the last breath, even in the face of death. And this is a study not about psychedelics. Many years ago, it was a meta-analysis about what are the important features that help people die better. And they surveyed patients and doctors and families. The two most top reasons were meaning and transcendence. And that's the heart of the psychedelic experience. Meaning making and transcending ordinary consciousness. And we're going to get into that. So this, in a way, forms the rationale for our therapy. And Cicely Saunders, who was the co-founder of hospice, wrote, you can find a degree of wholeness as a person whether you get better or not, whether you are suffering or not. And I've seen people find wholeness as they die. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the great Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, wrote, if you become whole again, you're healed. And you can be healed at the moment of death. Suffering is independent of our physical status. Suffering is our internal experience. And Viktor Frankl, again, I love this quote, because meaning making now is becoming a very big research area in America and in Europe. Meaning, not just for those who are dying, for all of us. We know that people who have personal meaning in their life do better in life. And Frankl wrote, man is not destroyed by suffering. He's destroyed by suffering without meaning. And we're going to talk about suffering in the afternoon as well. And finally, on this section, many global regulatory bodies have called out, you need to improve how we die. All the countries need to improve not just the medical care. We're getting better at chemotherapies, we're better at pain management, but there's a paucity of tools to work with the emotional anguish. And, medicalization has been helpful, obviously, but the medicalization of death is a problem. We've medicalized death and dying, and that was a mistake. In the early 20th century, death became kind of a taboo and pushed behind the curtain. It used to be part of life. When people died in America, even in the 1800s, the body stayed in the house for a few days. It was part of a village, a global experience. And now, we just don't talk about it. So let's talk about psychedelics a bit for 15 minutes and how we're working with this population. There's the great title of this week, How to Change Your Mind. That was a book by Michael Pollan. That New York Magazine was an article Michael Pollan wrote back in 2015, Fred remembers well. And that kind of brought out new research into the public consciousness. It was an article written about the research at NYU and Johns Hopkins. So, psychedelic, as my grandmother always told me, my yaya, every word comes from the Greek. So psychedelic, mind manifesting, making visible, revealing the true mind. And another word we use is called entheogen. You know what that means. The divinity within, bringing that divinity within out of us. And as Fred mentioned, these go back millennia. These aren't new. Some of them are new. LSD, as you heard earlier, was discovered in 1938 by Albert Hofmann, who was an incredible human being. But psilocybin goes back thousands of years, and we believe was used by indigenous cultures. Here you see the mushroom stones going to 1000 BC. We see pottery, all types of evidence of mushrooms being used in cultures. As we've heard, and people are speculating, it wasn't mushrooms, but there's some hypotheses that psychedelics were used here at Elefsina a long time ago. During the mysteries, Plato and Cicero and others came. They drank the kykeon, we don't know what that was. Some say it's a psychedelic. Where's Poppy? Is Poppy here? So I came to Eleusis in 15 years ago, 2009. And I wrote Poppy from America, I'm coming, and she was very generous and set up a time and a place at the site. And I met her and I came as the proud American with a stack of papers, and I'm going to show this Greek what this is about. And I tell her and I show, oh, look at the research. This was a psychedelic, nah? This was a psychedelic, we have proof here. And Poppy said, oh, no. and Poppy may be right. We need to be careful how we think about history. We don't know. Something happened there. But I like that we don't know yet, because what I like to say about our research is it's not about the drug per se. It's about the experience. And part of the problem, I think, with the psychedelic culture, which I'm very proud of, but it's becoming complicated, is we're worshiping these pills, but it's about the experience that we all can have in other ways as well, as we've heard about. It's our essence, this experience that we're going to talk about. It's who we are. The drug isn't the thing, it's that internal experience. And that's what's important. So in Eleusis, we don't know what happened with the Kikion, but we know they entered states of awareness that were profoundly insightful and helpful. Well, there it is, 2009 with Poppy at the site. You look the same, I got older, I know why. You live in the mysteries, I live in New York City. And New York City is very stressful. So now I have white hair and beard, and you look the same. So fast forward a couple of thousand years. In 1957, no one knew what the magic mushroom was, but a man named Gordon Wasson, who you've heard about, he co-authored The Road to Eleusis with Albert Hofmann and Carl Ruck. He went to Mexico with his wife, Valentina. She was a doctor, a physician, and they were in search of the magic mushroom. They've read about it, but no one knew about it yet. And they met this woman here, you see, Maria Sabina, who was a healer, and she invited Gordon Wasson into a ceremony. He had psilocybin mushrooms. He had a profound epiphany. He wrote about it in his famous Life magazine. Anybody recognize the actor on the cover? That's the Wizard of Oz. That's the lion from the Wizard of Oz, Burt Lahr. This magazine, the article went viral, although there was no viral back then. And Albert Hofmann and people in Switzerland began to synthesize the psilocybin for medical research. A couple of guys at Harvard named Timothy Leary and Dick Alpert, he became Ram Dass, and Ralph Metzner, who became later friends of mine, did what they did at Harvard, and we were off and running, and psilocybin became a therapeutic tool. I'm going to read to you just one line from Maria Sabina. She said to Gordon Wasson back in the 1950s, "There is a world beyond ours, a world that is far away, nearby, and invisible. And there is where God lives, where the dead live, the spirits and the saints, a world where everything has already happened and everything is known. That world talks. It has a language of its own. I report what it says. The sacred mushroom takes me by the hand and brings me to the world where everything is known." So psilocybin is, as Fred mentioned, an ingredient in hundreds of species of mushrooms. I'm not going to get into the neuroscience of it, but it affects the neurochemical serotonin. It's safe. It's not like other drugs that you can become addicted to. It doesn't trigger that reward system when you want more and more. And if you've had a psychedelic trip, you wouldn't want one the next day anyway. And let me talk a little bit about the important thing that Fred began to mention, this mystical experience in the next 10 minutes. There isn't one experience psychedelics generate. So when someone says, what's the psychedelic experience? There isn't one answer. But it can be autobiographical, it can be aesthetic, it can be sensory, it can be profoundly spiritual. But we do know it does generate a very profound spiritual dimension that for half a century we've called the mystical experience. And there's even a statistical and a scientific measure we use to measure that for half a century. The great Abraham Maslow called it a peak experience. And there's a few features. Fred already mentioned them, so I'm going to go quickly through them. One is unity, the subjective sense that we're all connected. Everything is connected. And people come out of the experience profoundly convinced we're all connected. And that's important because if we're connected, if him and I are connected, how do we hurt one another? So there's pro-social implications if we're all connected. The noetic quality, William James' term, that one is encountering ultimate reality. People say to us all the time, that was more real than this, or this is part of that, or that wasn't a drug effect, that was reality. That was something that's always here, but we're closed off to. A sense of sacredness. Or humility, deeply positive mood. I want to point out, and Fred did as well, it's not all fun and games, it's not all peaches and cream. They can be very difficult and challenging experiences, and that's why we do it in a very careful way. Ineffability, impossible to describe, and again, transcendence. Now, if you're dying of cancer, or of anything, and you know that your body is beginning to fail, and there's a limited amount of time that your body will be functioning, that experience is going to trigger profound stress, or can. People who come out of these experiences often tell us that the experience kind of pulled the lens back, and they found themselves in a much larger panoramic field. And it recalibrated or transformed what the self even is. And people will say, I'm not just my cancer. I'm not even this body. I'm something more enduring. Consciousness, whatever that is that we don't know, is more complex than I knew. And there's an acceptance and some kind of almost gratitude to unfold into the mystery of death. And that is a gift. And we see that over and over. Albert Einstein, who was a modern day mystic, wrote, "The most beautiful and profound emotion we can experience is the sensation of the mystical. It's the foundation of religion, and it's the true foundation of science." And as Fred mentioned, this mystical experience has been a predictor of better outcomes in some studies, particularly end of life. So I'm going to show you some scientific data, then show you more later, because I want to read you one thing from a patient. And quick, this is a great survey at Hopkins, and it's important to note that this is not the only way we can have these meaning-making experiences. So there was a survey where they compared people with a psychedelic experience that was spiritual and those who were naturally occurring. There was a study, a Pew study, 49% of Americans report having natural religious experiences. Maybe not 6 hours long like with LSD or psilocybin, but we've all had these transcendent moments in prayer, meditation, running, being in woods, spontaneous, dancing, drumming, making love. Humans are wired for meaning. Human beings are wired for meaning. And the question is, why would that be? Why? And in this survey, they compared the two experiences, and they're all the same. You can see all the data here. They both described it the same. This is our essence, I truly believe. So I'm going to show you that's where we did our study. Later today, I'm going to talk about how we do this study in more detail, how we prepare people. But that's where it's done in a very comfortable looking room. That's in a medical center, but it's like a comfortable living room. Our studies show that one dose of psilocybin in people who were dying with severe depression and anxiety reduced immediately depression, anxiety, demoralization, that awful experience, hopelessness. It improved spiritual well-being, quality of life, and the mystical experience was a predictor of who did better. These are some quotes from people in the trial. "This changed my life. I can't imagine it. Fear of cancer." One person said, "I felt this constant state of becoming. I felt gratitude. I felt welcome." A person who's a year away from death says death doesn't matter. A person who's a year away from dying says death doesn't matter. I'm less afraid of death. And I went through this quick. And we'll talk about love later on today as well. Everyone talks about love. Loving kindness towards self, towards others, and I like to use the word agape, that there's some incredible larger love that whatever is this, wherever we are, and that love somehow is the organizing principle of that. So real quick, a few slides. So you see it doesn't come out on the screen up here. So the top line is on top a line there, I don't know if you can see it, right here under these numbers. That's the placebo. So this is the day we gave the psilocybin, and I'll go through this later today. This is the placebo group. They took something that's not active. It wasn't psilocybin. This is the psilocybin group, and you see the big difference. The psilocybin group had a major reduction in depression. This scale, you see a major difference in anxiety and depression. These are very large gaps, what we call in science effect sizes. Very, very, very large changes and differences. And this is important. I told you earlier, it's impossible to treat hopelessness and demoralization. It's very difficult. The pink bar is the psilocybin group. The other bar is the placebo group. And you see the difference. Immediately, the demoralization, the psilocybin group was dramatically reduced. I want to read to you something from this lovely gentleman who I had the honor and privilege to work with. His name was Patrick Mattes. He was profiled in Michael Pollan's book, if you read that. He was one of the first people I worked with in the study. He was a young man who was in his 50s, and for a lot of us, we know that's young. He was an incredible guy, and he was a teacher to me, really, in the end. He had a horrible cancer of the bile ducts. It's an awful kind of cancer. He had an awful chemotherapy that was just crushing. And he entered the study. He had a lovely marriage to his wife, Lisa. And he was in good chance of dying within a year, and he did. He died a year later. We ask all our participants, as Fred mentioned, to go home and write a journal as much as you can. Remember what you remembered about the experience. I'm going to read you a little bit of this now, then we'll do more later today. Part of what Patrick wrote was, from here on, love was the only consideration. Everything that happened, he's describing his experience on psilocybin. That happened, anything and everything that was seen or heard, centered on love. It was and is the only purpose. Love seemed to emanate from a single point of light. It was so pure. The sheer joy was indescribable. And in fact, there are no words to accurately describe my state, my experience, or this place. I've had no earthly pleasure that's ever come close to this feeling. No sensation, no image of beauty. Nothing during my time on earth has felt as pure and glorious as the height of this journey. And he had a great life. He owned restaurants, he was a musician, he was a well-known journalist for a major network. He goes on and on. I'm gonna skip forward, but he talks about all the things we do every day. They're okay, but they're not the ultimate thing. We're focusing on the wrong thing. And he keeps coming back to it's love that matters. Patrick had what we call a death rebirth experience. We could talk about it later, where he experienced death in a way, like he died, and he came through. And I think that's what born again means. And that was an awakening. In the end, he said, and by the way, he talks about his death, and at one point he took a tour of his lungs. He went into his lungs, and he saw the cancer. And he said he was told by, some energy of voice, don't worry about the cancer. It's minor in the scheme of things. The more important thing is right in front of you, love. And he ends up writing, my life has changed in ways I may never fully comprehend, but I now have an understanding and awareness that goes beyond intellect, that my life and every life, that the universe equals one thing, love. I went to visit Patrick the week he died. And that's a picture of him. It looks great. He's sick, he's dying, but he looks full of life. He didn't want to leave his wife or this incredible gift we have, but the fear had gone away. When his study began, he gave them the pill at 9 o'clock in the morning. We're sitting there. We don't know what it is, placebo or psilocybin. And 2 hours later, he said, birth and death is a lot of work. The next day, we asked him, well, when you said that, what was happening? He said, that was the start of my journey. I went to visit him the week he died, and I said goodbye to him, knowing it was the last time. I cry easy. Do Greeks cry easy, or is it just me? I cry easy. And I was saying goodbye to him, and I was tearful. He gets out of the bed, he hugs me, and says to me, don't worry, it's going to be okay. Real quick, to confirm this isn't just a drug. I've been studying what's called near-death experiences, people who have cardiac death, who are dead legally, and then are resuscitated back to life. And we're studying these experiences they have. And 15% of them report these incredible experiences. Kenneth Ring, who's a researcher, says that of all the lessons of the near-death experience, the NDE, none is greater than the importance of love. And the NDE teaches about love is that everything is made of love and comes from love. So let me close up here. Who knows Thich Nhat Hanh? Somebody, please. Good. Oh, wow, good. The great Zen monk. Our true nature is the nature of no birth and no death. Only by touching on true nature can we transcend the fear of non-being, the fear of annihilation. In Mount Athos, where I was in 1997, 25 years ago, there's a monastery, St. Paul Monastery, where it says if you die before you die, then you won't die when you die. If we can taste death now, we can be freed up to live a full life. And finally, last slide, astronauts have these experiences. Who knows about the overview effect? Good. So Google the overview effect. Many astronauts on the moon when we had Apollo missions and in the space shuttles have these experiences because just viewing the Earth from there can generate a mystical experience. Edgar Mitchell in 1971, on the way back from the Apollo 14 mission, wrote about his experience. He was in the cockpit looking at the window on the way back, the sun, the moon, the stars. Complete mystical experience. He experienced the astronauts, the spaceship, everything as one being. He came back to Earth. He left NASA. He founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences in California. And he spent his life dedicated to understanding consciousness. I'll see you all about 4:30 today.
Before you leave the podium, I have a question. Which is, my father passed away in April, and I know that he was given morphine to assist in, he didn't request it, but I'm under the impression that part of the process of administering morphine and having a hospice experience is also very helpful for the people who are still alive to do that, to move through the process with the loved one. But if you could just very quickly tell me what the difference would be because morphine is really just about taking away pain, isn't it? It has nothing to do with going into any kind of altered thing. So,
yeah, morphine is just a pain medicine, a useful one. I used to run a pain center also, and yeah, but there's no effect on. Well, there's an effect on the mind, but not in this way.
Okay.
And by the way, you mentioned the family. We'll talk about it later. Families are healed by this. Only the dying person doesn't suffer. The family suffers. The ripple effect goes out to all the people in that person's life. And when Patrick, when he died, the way he died, his wife was very grateful. I still know her. She's very grateful how he died. And it affects the entire family. So and we're going to try to do a trial to give it to caregivers. Can we give the medicine to doctors? Can we give it to members of the family? Psychedelics, as Fred will tell you, we're just in the infancy. In baseball terms, top of the first inning. But so we got to be careful. The press and the media are kind of really going rapidly, but we're just starting out. Siga siga, as my yaya would say.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay, so awesome sauce. Next, we'll hear from Christina Dalla, Associate Professor of Department of Pharmacology, Medical School, National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, member of Directors European Brain Foundation and President of Hellenic Brain Council. And so another perspective and another approach to a deeper understanding.
Thank you very much. First of all, maybe we should stand up a bit for a while to stretch again, like yesterday. Because I was told that I need to move, so maybe you should move as well. Okay, thank you. So I would like to thank Alexandra, Miss Mitsotaki, that I recently met and I really admire her and I want to become like you one day. And Myrto, of course, who is the heart of the organization. And everybody that is here and all my friends and colleagues and my new friends and colleagues. And so to begin, I think I have 20 minutes. Okay, thank you. I'll try to be fast. So yesterday, Brian was asked, why now? So why now? I think you already know that we have a crisis. We have a mental health crisis, of course, along with all the other crises, environmental and everything else. And we know from, at least in Europe, but globally, from data from the European Brain Council, that 1 in 4 people is affected by a mental disorder. That includes depression, anxiety disorders, sleep problems, and many others that you already heard. And most of it manifests before the age of 25. So we really need to take care of the new generation, our teenagers and our students. So what can we do? You can see here some global data. This is from, actually it's not from Nature Mental Health. The next thing is from Nature Mental Health. That's from Lancet, that was published recently, Psychiatry. And you can see these beautiful lines, but these colors really represent the number of years of disability. That means the numbers of years that someone is not functional, is not well, they cannot work or live or be part of the society. And you can see the effects in age on the vertical axis, and on the x-axis, the number of disabilities. In red, we have depression and anxiety, and of course, there are other disorders that are also very serious. And you can see that women are more affected than men. This is actually my line of research, and just bear with me just to tell you a bit things of what we are doing in our lab at the University of Athens, and I will connect it with psychedelics very soon. So recently, I wrote a piece of how we need to integrate sex and gender research into mental health research about preclinical and clinical studies. And when we're talking about sex and gender, it's about the broad term that includes both intersex and transgenders, everybody. So that's why I was very happy yesterday that we had a session about the feminine, the day before yesterday, and the gender. Also, we have been advocating for many years, and we have written many pieces. This is one with representatives from the European Brain Project and the Women's Brain Project, excuse me, and from European Medicines Agency. And this is about integrating sex-related differences research into drug discovery development. And of course, even from my PhD thesis more than 20 years ago, and as a student, and later and still in our lab, we work on serotonin, and you heard a bit about serotonin, and we know that serotonin is a chemical in the brain, it's a neurotransmitter, it's not a hormone, it's a neurotransmitter, and it really correlates with mood. Of course, it's very important also for sleep, for appetite, for many different things, probably with mystical experience as well. And it correlates with depressive behavior. So it's this yellow chemical here that is released by the synapses. The synapses is where the two neurons are talking to each other. So it's the place where our neurons communicate, our cells in the brain, they communicate. And serotonin is one of the neurotransmitters that is released there. And we have also found that there are regions in the brain and networks. Of course, there are many other labs and colleagues that they have found this, but we recently found a very specific brain regions, the nucleus reunions, that it's supposed to connect the system that responds to stress, and it has something to do with depression. And this also took some publicity some years ago in Greece about these regions. All of these are preclinical studies in animals. And we have found that this is also related to neuroplasticity that you already heard from Dr. Barrett. This is a very small video. I just found it on YouTube, but I also saw this at my students. Just very briefly to explain you what neuroplasticity is. Can I? Oh, it doesn't play. Can you play it or not? I don't know if they can play it. It's integrated from YouTube. If not, I can. So here. I should stop pressing, right? Okay. So, okay, let's wait a bit. It's just that you will see it's how our synapses connect in the brain and how some neurons. So it doesn't work. It's okay. The idea of neuroplasticity is that our brain can change. So we are constantly learning things, and our brain can be rewired. And there are new dendrites in the brain. So you can see here from that study with the network of in the brain about stress and depression, that on the left we have a normal neuron cell in the brain. It's like a tree. When we have stress, this is a protocol of chronic mild stress, there is a shrinkage of this neuron, the second picture. And then there is this process of neuroplasticity that we can, in a way, try to make our neurons flourish again. And we can do that with different ways. Here, in this study, we gave an SSRI, a medicine, and a depressant, sertraline. Or we manipulated this network in the brain, and so the dendrites were okay again. So the neuroplasticity was back. We can also see it with spines. These are the buttons in our neurons. These are real pictures from an optical microscope. And you can see on the left, the second picture with stress, how these are less, they disappear, they start disappearing. But when we can reverse it and restore it, and we can have more spines in our brain, and this can help the neurons to communicate and release serotonin and do all these amazing neuroplasticity things. So there are several ways to enhance neuroplasticity. In the video, there was also a small drawing of a person meditating. So there are some evidence that meditation might increase neuroplasticity in the brain. And of course, we know that some drugs, I'm a pharmacologist, so I'm not going to talk about other stuff, but we know that some medicines can also do that. And psychotherapy, of course. There are a lot of studies. So what else can increase neuroplasticity? As we heard before from Dr. Barrett very nicely, psychedelics do, and this is just one study that I put here, a very recent one, and I will tell you why I chose this one. We can see that also on the left is just the control, the neuron that hasn't received any drug, but in the middle we have LSD administration, and on the right we have psilocybin from the magic mushrooms, this molecule. And you can see how the dendrites are becoming bigger, and how this is something that we can count also. And you can see also the spines, how they're different with LSD. So these are the neurons in the brain. And we know that psychedelics, as you heard before, they act on serotonin, on a receptor of serotonin. Receptors are small molecules, proteins in our brain, where serotonin goes and binds. So it's like, we say at the classes that it's like how the key goes into the lock and opens a door. So I don't know, I just think that this door might be something else also. But anyway, serotonin can open this door on the receptor, 5-HT2A receptor. And as we heard, we were working on serotonin, on depression, on neuroplasticity. So for me, the next logical step is to work on psychedelics. I haven't done any work on classical psychedelics yet. This is one slide that we saw at our students. I teach at the medical school. This is from an elective course that the medical students take it, and also psychologists enroll at this course as well. And we saw this slide. So the classical ones, you already heard, we're not going to lose time on that. We have done work with ketamine, which is a non-classical psychedelic. It's a much more dangerous compound, and, but it's also licensed as a drug for treatment-resistant depression. So ketamine, S-ketamine, which is very equivalent to ketamine, it was a special K, maybe someone knows it. It was a drug of abuse. It's an anesthetic, and in a very low doses, it can be a very powerful drug. Only in hospitals with very strict regulations, it can be used for treatment-resistant depression. So we do studies with ketamine, and now we want to advance to classical psychedelics, that they are probably safer as well, as you heard. And we're submitting a grant very soon with the Research Institute of Bioactive Natural Products from the University of Athens. We have here some colleagues, Professor Charbopoulos and others, that they are also members of this group. Greece has a very strong tradition and very strong science into medicinal plants, from cannabis to anything that you can imagine, and a lot of history, of course. And so we hope that we'll be able to produce these mushrooms in Greece, and then being able to make the psilocybin to do the preclinical and the clinical studies. This picture is from a Canadian company that is doing the same thing that we are trying to hopefully do here also in Greece in the future. Thank you. We'll see next year, maybe we'll have some effects. And then I was very lucky that I was invited to the psychedelic research group, target group at the European College of Neuropsychopharmacology to become a member. And you can see here it's the idea that we stand on the shoulders of giants in a way, because we have there David Nutt and Guy Goodwin, and now we also have you, and we're very grateful for that. You already saw some studies of these people, but there are also many other Europeans from Sweden, from Switzerland, Denmark, the chair is from Denmark, from Holland, of course, UK, and from Mediterranean, we are the only ones from Mediterranean in general. I hope we'll have more in the future. We had an amazing meeting at Nice in March, so I can tell you more about that. So David Nutt, that maybe you know him, it's very interesting to see some of his video and read his work. He's working on psychedelics also for many years, and at Imperial College in UK, and you can see that they are also running studies with similar things that you already heard. We hope that we'll have him in Greece next year, so I will let you know. And so this idea has expanded in Europe, everywhere in the world, but also in Europe, even in Europe that we are supposed to be more conservative in a way. But you see that there are many pieces writing about psychedelics now at the press, and also after this was also legalized in Australia. Maybe you already know that in Australia it's legalized for medical doctors in very specific settings to administer for treatment-resistant depression, for post-traumatic stress disorder, I think existential stress as well, magic mushrooms and psilocybin, and MDMA as well, that we haven't talked about it, which is ecstasy. And after that, there are also many research centers in Europe. These are from the Mind Foundation, that is, I think, in Germany located, and also from Sweden and other places. So this is going to be our future, I believe. And I hope that Greece could also play a role in that. And to finish, this was also even taken by the MEPs at the European Parliament. There were some of them that they wrote a letter to the European Medical Agency. Most of them are Spanish. And so they asked at the European Medicine Agency to advance research on psychedelics and really help facilitate this kind of research, which was something very impressive. Of course, the press took it as well, and they wrote about it. And not only psilocybin, but also MDMA, that I repeat, it's the old ecstasy that we knew. And it's also a powerful drug for treating a post-traumatic stress disorder. We'll see very soon it will be licensed, I believe, hopefully. Also, the European Medicine Agency responded. They wrote a piece at Lancet in March. That was February, the other one was in March, just before our meeting at Nice. And they say that we really do need to do this work, of course, with all the regulations, be very careful and respect all the things that you already heard and avoid all the risks. And also, I'm very happy to see that at the very recent report in September, where they issued guidelines for for doing research for treating depression, they have included psychedelics. And also they have included some of our studies about sex and gender effects, which is also very happy for me. But also in psychedelics, and they say that we should begin with treatment-resistant depression. And I'm very happy that here is also the director of the psychiatric clinic in Athens, Professor Nikos Stefanis. And we were talking about maybe if we have the chance to start trying doing some clinical trials also in Athens. So, and I only have 2 slides yet. This is also the goal of the European Brain Council that I mentioned at the beginning. I'm very honored to be a member. We also have other members, Dr. Sotiropoulos and others here, so they are from this Brain Council. And also we have founded the Hellenic Brain Council in Greece. And this is a thing that we're trying to promote. We're also doing a lot of advocacy work at the European level and national level. And if you take a minute to read it, I think it was very impressive for me, because we are using the term brain capital policy, but we're also talking not only about treating psychiatric disorders, but also to enhance creativity, resilience, design thinking, systems integration, entrepreneurship, self-awareness, self-control. And how can we do that? I'm not going to answer, but it's a thing that I think is very nice and important. And this is also the European Brain Foundation, that is very close, that we are talking about this. And you can hear more at the meeting of the European College of Neuropsychopharmacology next week at Barcelona. There will be a session and many activities about psychedelics, scientific, of course, and also even at the Mediterranean Neuroscience Society meeting that we're having at Nice on October 13th. There is also a session on psychedelics, even in Tunis, Cartaz, at Carchidona, and that's very impressive. This is on the left is the first book that we wrote, where we mention about psychedelics, and we give it to the students. And there we explain that this could be the future also of psychopharmacology. Also, we write about ketamine, about cannabis, medicinal cannabis, of course. And these are also other books that we have published with the Cretan Press. So I would also like to thank all my colleagues, my collaborators, the members of my group, and my collaborators. Some of them are here as well, and our funding sources, of course. And finish here. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's very encouraging to see all of this research and sort of giving credibility to the science and the potential application. So thank you so much. Appreciate that. So before we move on, I just want to make clear that we will open the floor up for dialogue and opportunity to ask questions. So I know that there's a lot of information coming from this distinguished panel, and I'm hoping some of you are taking notes so that you can have your questions ready, or maybe statements that you want to include and provide. But before we get to those questions, I want to invite Jules Peck to come back through Zoom. He's the creator of Reworlding Fellowship in collaboration with Imperial College. So let us bring back Jules to the Zoom. And of course, if you need to get up and go to the bathroom or get some water or stretch your legs, feel free to do so. Everyone should have agency over the needs that they have with themselves. So, and if anyone here on the panel wants to get up and get some fresh air, please feel free to do so as well if you don't want to sit here. But I appreciate you sharing the stage with us all together. Do we have Zoom? Is Zoom coming? Okay, there's Jules. Jules, welcome. Can you hear us?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Wonderful. I see you've shared your screen, so feel free to get right to it.
Yeah, let me just see. Has that worked? Can you see that first slide okay?
It's blank. We don't see anything. I see your arrow, your cursor moving around, but I don't see an image.
Interesting. Okay. Can you show the slides?
Yes, we can.
And Great. If you can put the slides up.
All right. I want to make sure that you can see which slide is up that's being put up.
Yeah, I can see myself. So if you put the slides up on the screen now,
it's coming.
Then
perfect. It's
fantastic.
Coming. Where are you physically? In what location are you?
Well, I'm not in that woodland setting. That's a backdrop. I'm in England. It's about 10 or 15 degrees colder than I can tell. It's quite warm there. I could see people fanning themselves. So bit of a different climate here.
Yes, well, we're grateful to have you here. Do we have the slides? They're up. Okay, yeah, the first slide is up.
Okay, fantastic. I can't actually see them, but never mind. So hopefully that's the first slide, which says Reworlding Fellowship. And I'll just say, I can see you now, great. So a little bit of a different approach here. The Reworlding Fellowship it's an experiment to try and see if we can help shift the center of gravity of people's values using psychedelics. The reason for that I'll explain over the program is to see if through changing people's values we can change the way they live and the way they interact with the world to create system change. And the headline on the slide there, the subtext, distinguishes us from the sort of self-orientated and health-orientated psychedelics work, because what we're asking here is ask not what these plant medicines can do for me, but what through them can I do to change the world. So if we put the next slide up, I'll just a little bit of context.
It's up.
Okay, it's up. I'm going to change my view so that I can see gallery. Perfect. So very brief context. I don't need to labor this. We're living in meta crisis. We're killing our one planet. Well-being is flatlining. A meta crisis of inequality, extremism, tribalism, and so forth. And that's the context for the program that we're running here. The work I do is focused on that meta crisis and how we can shift beyond it. Next slide, please. So that meta crisis is really just the symptom of a broken system and of a broken story. If you like, the Hobbesian story of materialism, private vices, public benefits, bowling alone individualism, and so forth. that we live in a world of egoism, not ecoism, disconnected from the natural world. So we clearly need a new story. We need a new system of economics, democracy, and so forth. And I believe, and the people I work with believe, that if we're going to get this new story and this new way of life and this system change, we need to change our values. So we could have the next slide up, please. This is what's known as the values circumplex. And if you click again, there should be a sort of left to right arrow that comes up on that slide if whoever's running the slides. Yeah. So top right hand corner, we've got what are known as we values. So those are universal values of protecting the environment, equality, social justice, inner harmony. At the bottom left, you've got what are known as extrinsic values, me values, around power, ambition, wealth, and so forth. Now, we all live these different values at different times in our lives, and there are tensions between these two extremes of extrinsic and intrinsic values. And where we sit on this, where we dance, if you like, on this value circumplex, very much determines the way we live our lives. So people in that bottom left-hand, extrinsically orientated values world tend to be less open to pro-environmental and pro-social behavior change messaging. They have higher environmental footprints. Interestingly, they have lower well-being as well, compared to people who live their lives largely mediated through intrinsic values at the top right. So ideally, we want society and individually, we want to be shifting values and the way we dance on that value circumplex more towards the top right, the intrinsic we values. Next slide, please. Now, where we dance on that circumplex is very much determined by the values water we swim within. But of course, like fish that don't know they're swimming through water, we don't understand that we are swimming through values water. We're immersed in messaging which encourages us to think of ourselves as extrinsically orientated, and that encourages us to think of others as extrinsically orientated, more extrinsically orientated than they actually are. And this leads to a self-reinforcing process where values, particularly in Western consumerist societies, are overtly shifting towards the extrinsic orientation. Next slide, please. Now, the good news is this is known as the seesaw effect between the we values and me values, extrinsic and intrinsic. We can actually shift the center of gravity of our individual values and of societal values. And there's a lot of research around this. So if we dial up intrinsic values in the narratives, the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we're surrounded by, and we dial down the extrinsic values, narratives, and stories, we actually find that people's center of gravity, where they dance on that value circumplex, shifts more towards those intrinsic we values, which we need if we're going to increase well-being and pro-environmental and pro-social behavior change. So that was just a bit of a contextualization around what I mean by values, because that underpins the Rewilding Fellowship and why we're using psychedelics. So next slide, please. This shows 3 hypotheses of the Rewilding Fellowship. I'll leave those up while I just explain the genesis of this project. I went to a talk by an academic called Professor Robin Carhart Harris a few years ago, and it was on psychedelics. The work he did at Imperial College. He's now in California, and he said something really interesting. Lots of really interesting things in this talk about psychedelics, but the one particular thing that stood out for me was he talked about this strange rebus effect, as it's known, relaxed beliefs under psychedelics, where there's what he described as a political and values plasticity that goes on, that our values become plastic through psychedelics. So I thought, well, that's fascinating, because my work's all about how we shift values in individuals and society to change the world and to deal with system change. So I went up to him afterwards and I said, I've got this crazy idea. Could we sort of combine my work with psychedelics? And he said, well, that sounds a bit scary and a bit Timothy Leary, but why don't you come and see my team at Imperial? So I went to Imperial soon after and gave a talk on an idea that I'd had. That's now led to the Reworlding Fellowship that we're doing. We're working with Imperial College now on this. And those three hypotheses are sort of underpin the program. The first one, as I've explained, values are key to system change. The second one, this idea that psychedelics can relax and make plastic our values, and with the right context, set and setting, perhaps our values can be shifted through a program, and that perhaps through those changes in values, we can become change makers and change the worlds we work within. So the next slide, please, is just a few quotes which emphasize this, which some of my favorite quotes. I think Thomas Bjorkman might be there, actually, I'm not sure. But Thomas says, it is possible to collectively change the narrative of what it is to be human and to set a new course for humanity beyond climate crisis, polarized societies and failed leadership. Stan Groff, who I think has been mentioned already, psychedelics are to psychology as the telescope to astronomy or the microscope to bacteria. Matt Johnson, who I think has also been mentioned, he talks about psychedelics being literally a reboot of the system, a biological control alt delete. Carl Harris talks about psychedelic experiences positively predicting liberal political views, openness, and nature relatedness. And then finally, Dennis McKenna talks about the message of ayahuasca to humanity as a clear one. Wake up to the responsibility we all have to care for the planet, and most importantly, take action. And it's that take action piece that we're really focused on. We're asking people whether they can change who they are and take action through the program. So next slide, please. There are four important elements to the rebus effect. They're firstly the priming, the context. We do that through a curriculum and conversations and stories which we explore, which I'll explain in a minute. That then leads to the second piece, which is the set. So the set, the mindset that you approach a psychedelic experience with is crucial to determining the outcome. The next piece is setting, and I'll explain the physical setting where we do this in Costa Rica. It's been very important for our program. And then the fourth piece is the integration, and I'll now just explain that in more detail. Next slide, please, just to talk to you about the Rewilding program. It's an 8-month journey that people sign up to. We take cohorts of between 20 and 30 people. We have one running at the moment. It involves 3 months of what we call priming. So there's a rich curriculum of guest speakers, of lots of reading, conversations one-to-one and in groups. So that's the sort of the priming and set piece of the program. We then have a 2-week retreat in Costa Rica, psychedelics. In this case, this particular cohort, we're using psilocybin and San Pedro, but we will be using different mixtures of psychedelics over different cohorts. We then follow that with a 3-month program of integration, weekly group and smaller session with each other. This is all on Zoom, the integration process. And then finally, all of this is being followed through a battery of questionnaires that Imperial College are using to research the change in a whole variety of things that I'll explain in a minute across the 8-month program. Next slide, please. Some of the curriculum, the priming, the set, if you like, I'll just sort of read out a little bit of the headlines. So we explore things like the historical evolution of power and privilege, systems thinking, structural power analysis, decolonizing, deprogramming our minds, examining our shadow side, the need to rewild ourselves, connect with nature and shift from egoism to ecoism, leadership in times of crisis, and alternative emerging socioeconomic systems. So those are some of the things we explore that provide the priming and the set. Next slide, please. The setting is a beautiful retreat center in Costa Rica run by my partner on this program, Alnor Ladar. It's a fantastic place to experience the psychedelic element of the program. And that we ran that in August for this cohort. Next slide, please. This is the core team. We have a much bigger team behind the program, but this is just the core team. So myself, Al Noor are the co-curators. We have two facilitators, Joel and Jen, facilitators of the psychedelic program, and they're involved throughout the 8 months. Maxine from Brave Earth, and then a team from Imperial College. You'll know some of their names. They've all done super fascinating work. Lior Roseman, who works with peace and reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians with psychedelics. Chris Timmerman, who works with psychedelics and belief systems. And Orla and James supporting them. So those are the team at Imperial College who are working closely with us on this. Next slide, please, just explains a little bit about the current cohort. So we have a very diverse, these are archetypes, we're keeping it confidential, of course, who exactly is on the program. Very diverse group from across the world, global north, global south, genders, ages, 21 to 80. So we've got, for instance, on this current program, activists, bankers, a member of parliament, quite a few lawyers, professors, artists, so a really diverse group of people. Next slide, please. So these are some of the things we're researching, some of these at the scales that we've identified around identity, well-being, meaning and satisfaction, values, aspiration, authentic leadership, political orientation. And we're using all of these scales and more. Next slide, please. So now I'm just going to finish by taking you through, we don't have the research finished yet. We're only halfway through the first cohort, and it'll take some time to pull the research together. But just give you some examples of some early findings we've got that are emerging. So this is just an early snapshot. This was this is a base snapshot of the political perspectives of the current cohort. And as you can see, it's quite overtly left-leaning, this cohort. We hope to have a much more diverse spectrum of people from different political perspectives on future cohorts. But that gives you one example of the kind of research that's emerging. Next slide, please. Another really important scale we're using is PVQ from Shalom Schwartz, Portrait Values Questionnaire. This is all about the values. So you can see the sorts of things that people are asked about, how important to them is creativity, wealth, success, equality, loyalty, and so forth. Next slide, please. This slide is a snapshot of values, PVQ 21, just from the beginning of the retreat that we had in August to the end. And what you see here is positive change is in green, things people moved closer to, and red is things that people moved further from. And next slide, I'll go into the details on that. So the things that became more important for this group over the 2-week retreat, which is just one part of the research we're doing, of course. The sorts of things became more important, getting respect from others and having people do as they say, looking after the environment and so forth. The next slide in red, sorry, can you clicks, and then the next slide should be red, great. So these are the sorts of things that became less important to people over the 2-week retreat. You know, being successful, recognized for achievements and so forth. Next slide, please, and I'm coming to the end now. You'll be pleased to hear. This one is the Aspiration Index, another scale, Tim Kasser's Aspiration Index. This is a snapshot at the beginning of the retreat of the whole group, where they orientate on aspiration. And you'll see there that some of the most important goals and aspirations for people were things around being loved and loving. And some of the least important ones were being wealthy and being admired, you know, perhaps not so surprising on a quite a sort of left-leaning cohort, perhaps. Next scale, how did on the aspiration index specifically, how did things change during the retreat? Again, it's from beginning to end of the retreat. And again, you see things in green are things that became more important to the group, things like making the world a better place, and things that became less important, things like money and fame. Next slide, here is the same aspiration index for an individual, a middle-aged female individual on the cohort. and how her values, aspirations changed during the retreat. Many of them stayed the same, especially the ones that were already at around 7. But there were some interesting shifts in things like make the world a better place and lifestyle factors. These are all only snapshots, so we'll have probably much more interesting research as we look right across the 8-month program. Much more change we expect. Final couple of slides. Another scale, the value congruence. So how congruent values are. This first slide is at the beginning of the program, and we see that, interestingly, for this group as a whole, one of the values that was really important was that their work is aligned with their values. That's not always the case, of course. We often find ourselves doing jobs which are not at all aligned with our values. This group happened to have people who were fairly well aligned with their values, which was interesting. Then next slide, please. Here again, at the end of the retreat, this is from beginning to end, we see the shifts in things that people shifted towards in terms of values congruence in green, and red, things they moved away from. And actually there was a move towards more willingness to make sacrifices and to be aligned with their values. So there we go. That's me done, really. That was just a snapshot of what we're doing. I rushed through it rather, but hopefully that made sense. We'll have a lot more really, really rich research that's going to emerge after the program finishes in November, and then this will all be written up in academic papers by Imperial College, and will feed into how we design the future cohorts. And we're already signing people up to the next cohorts. So if you'd like to be involved, or you know anyone who might like to be involved in the next Rewilding Fellowship, please do get in touch, and I think my email's up on the slide there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Jules. Something that you spoke about, which I think is very, very important to get a little more into, and I think, yeah, please, I think some of the panelists can speak to this too, is the concept and idea of integration. Once you've had a journey, you're left with this feeling, sometimes euphoric, and it feels like, wow, I can't believe what I saw or what I felt, and then it's over, and then what do you do with it? So I think the idea, I don't know if Jules is going to continue to join us in the conversation, but it would be great to keep him up on the Zoom so we can see him if he wants to chime in. And he says he's there. Okay, great, there you are. Sorry, I couldn't see behind me. But I'm wondering if maybe we could just start a little bit of the conversation with what was being talked about in terms of integration. And especially, I mean, I'm sure whether it's birthing or whether it's dying, there's still an integration process that deserves to be discussed.
By the way, great. Thank you for that lecture. It was excellent. And that dovetails so well with what we see in the research that we do. Your question is crucial, and we'll talk about it more later as well. The experience alone does not always change people. Unless it changes your values and your life and your behavior, then it was just a one-off, and that doesn't mean as much. The great Houston Smith, who was one of the participants in one of the early trials for healthy adults with spiritual leanings, and one of the world's most famous comparative religion scholars, had a wonderful quote. He said, "A spiritual experience doesn't necessarily make a spiritual life." So a lot of people have a psychedelic experience and they brag about it, and it was great, and they experience profound things, and then a week later maybe they're not changed. Then I'm not sure what that is. I mean, it's a great experience, but this is about trying to cultivate lasting changes in people. So integration is the process in the short term, what we do with people to help integrate and talk about it. And for them, after they leave, with their life. It's integrating the stuff. If forgiveness came up for you in the experience, then go and apply it. Call the brother you didn't speak to in 3 years and forgive him, or apply it. Make those changes, and then it matters for you, and more importantly, because of the theme of the conference, the world around you.
You know, on that. Before you give us your take on integration, I wanted to just, say sometimes when we go to hear a symphony, or if we are in the midst of something very beautiful, art, we don't always know how long-lasting that experience is. I know from a personal experience, I did an ayahuasca journey, and the process of that integration, I feel like, is ongoing. And for instance, my relationship to my own mother completely shifted. I don't feel like I changed anything. I don't really see how she changed anything, but just something shifted. And sometimes the integration is also an unconscious process, but tell me your thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, so just a couple thoughts, I'll keep them brief. One is that the essence of psychedelic therapy, as I see it, is not an event. Partially rephrasing what you just said, it's the beginning of a journey. The first study that I was involved with at Hopkins is still not yet fully published. It's a study of people with a long-term meditation experience and practice, and how psychedelic experiences interacted with those. There are leaders, at least of the American Buddhist community, principal of them maybe being Jack Kornfield, who are open and forward about their experience with psychedelics leading them to Buddhism, and sharing stories of psychedelics leading you to similar places in your mind as long-term meditation retreats or extended practice. And so we wanted to understand this. And it was remarkable. One of the participants that I was guiding and facilitating, they were having a high-dose psilocybin session, and at the same time, there was this Buddhist monk who was visiting Roland Griffiths in his office just down the hall from this experience, and the monk said, "Oh my God, I want to talk to that person like right now," and it was at the end of the day. The participant was mostly resolved from their subjective experience, and we were doing kind of debriefing, and we said, would you like to meet this monk? And they were like, "Oh yeah, absolutely." And the monk sat down and he said, "What will you do differently?" And the person who had the experience said, "Oh, I've connected with peace and a place of no suffering, and I'm very engaged." No, you didn't listen to what I said. What will you do? What behaviors will change? What impact will the world feel from the way you've changed? What will you do? And I think that really perfectly summarizes integration process. It's figuring out what you're going to do. Feeling different's great. Having a story in your head's awesome. A pleasurable experience, that's lovely. But what will change? And sometimes that is an awful lot of work in a person's life, and the integration process is necessary after that beginning of the experience to get to that journey.
He's gone, okay. Let me just begin to open up to the audience if people have questions and things that they want to make comments about, because there's really so much to potentially unpack and to discuss and to talk about. So I'll come to you first. I feel like Phil Donahue.
It's okay. Okay, Fred Barrett mentioned that in order to administer some psychedelic, you have first of all to, you mentioned before that in order to administer a psychedelic, you need to do a very good screening before, in order to, in case, and to exclude those that are at risks for psychosis. And I think most of us who have heard that psychedelics could trigger some bad effects in persons that they have a tendency with psychosis. But in case that these psychoses haven't done their coming out and is somewhere hidden, how you are able to distinguish the one that they have this tendency or not is through the stage of preparation, and I have a second question right after.
So it's an excellent question. We do an in-depth, intensive psychiatric interview to understand not only does the person themselves have a history of psychosis, but does anyone in their family have a history of psychosis? What about their parents, their relatives? And it's imperfect. but it's the best that we can do. And it's a possible risk that has been somewhat described in previous literature, and it's something that we need to learn more about to know exactly what the risk is and how do we identify it. One additional element, there are a number of case reports that have come out recently of people who have bipolar disorder with mania, and they took magic mushrooms and then had a manic episode. It's becoming a little more clear that may be a definite risk factor. But of course, bipolar disorder is also difficult to diagnose. So it's imperfect, and we do our best. But within go ahead. I was going to say, but within the carefully controlled studies that we've conducted at Hopkins, at NYU, around the world, I'm actually not aware in the modern era of anyone who has had a psychotic reaction afterwards and uncovers psychosis. So I think the screening that we're doing now is effective. The question is if and when these are approved as medicines, well, how do we know then?
Just to echo that, the screening now is effective for us. It may not be in other models. But real quick, most what's called first episode psychotic breaks occur early 20s, mostly in people's lives. So if someone's 45 years old and never had a psychotic break and there's no evidence of bipolar, it looks a little easier. And what happened probably in the 1960s, everyone knows about all the stories, right? People became schizophrenic, became psychotic. What likely happened, at least in part of those experiences, a young person may be on track for a first episode break in his late teens, early 20s, has a psychedelic, and it kind of facilitates that. He was already on track because he was kind of genetically or psychologically loaded for that. So, but with that knowledge in mind and our careful screening, the trials are going well. But again, as Fred said, when this gets unleashed into cultures without guardrails, that's a different conversation.
So the target group is a bit, not someone in his 20s, but someone that he has, let's say, the chance to have revealed some of his... Okay, and the second question, very quickly, is before it was very nice to have the idea that all this helps and enhance the synapses, so it would have, I don't know, meta-humans that will have good progress and, as Zil said, everything positive and good values. But in my understanding, all the work that you have done, you have to have guides and support to all that journey in order the values to have a better positioning in the map. And what about if the guidance is not so brilliant? Because as soon as the filters go down, and you are more, how we say it, you can more easily be guided if you don't have a brilliant guide and you have someone that would like to drive you. I mean, I find it a bit intimidating that the guide can guide you.
I think it's, it's also an excellent question and a complicated one. I think there are no clear standards for how to train therapists to do this. But the couple things we think we know, I believe at least, are that if you have someone with whom the patient can build therapeutic alliance, and it's a compassionate human being who has training as a psychotherapist, it's probably going to be okay. I think that's a good basis and foundation.
And now, importantly, we have to redefine guide. So I'm not a guide. I know we use that word, but a guide implies I know where they're going. So if you hire a guide to go to the top of the Mount Everest or somewhere, he or she knows where to take you. I don't know where they're going to go. So it's not the greatest word. There isn't a great word for what we do. But a better description is that we're trying to create an emotional and physical environment that at best safely allows that person to go with the unfolding of the changes of consciousness in a safe way with interpersonal support and assurance. So if they get into kind of very challenging spaces, we're there to encourage them. They're safe, even hold their hand, stay with them, breathe through it. We teach some techniques before, I'll talk about it later. So it's presence and providing that environment where wherever they're at has much more wisdom than I'll ever have, because they're now in a potentially very powerful state of consciousness. So I can't say anything really except some things we know how to be safe. We want to encourage the unfolding. And that's important. And that takes presence, maturity, to be with the moment, to be empathically aligned. And that's all crucial. And plus, clinical training matters, the therapeutic relationship, understanding psychiatric challenges, all of that as well. D, what? Sorry. Is your regulation easy?
Is manipulation easier?
Manipulation? You mean in a
I don't know.
I don't negative way?
So in case that you want to manipulate a person in order to have, to change his values.
In a positive or negative way? Positive.
Negatively, in case you
Negative.
in case that you need negative.
Well, that's very
Can
dangerous. So, yeah, I mean, if I think we hear what you're saying, look at Charlie Manson. Yeah, I mean, right now I know there are groups. There are bad actors, so to speak, who use medicine. They don't become better people. It amplifies their dangerous thinking. So the medicine isn't going to make people Mother Teresa, And yes, that's a very serious question. Can people use it negatively to manipulate people? But yeah.
Just very quickly, I think we need to remember that this is going to be a medical intervention, and in all medical intervention, even when we take blood, we need to weigh the risk and the benefit. So, of course, there is risk. There is risk even with SSRIs, with anything there is risk, even with paracetamol. But we need to weigh the benefit, and we believe so far it seems that the benefit is much higher than the risk.
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for all this work and all this information that we've received today. And I want to ask a question which you may not have been testing for, and it has a little bit more to do with what Jules has been looking at. Hi, Jules. To what extent can we really talk about the change in an individual being valuable for the wider society if the public space that they return to hasn't really changed? That's a big question for me. And within that question, I think this is, Jules, I think this is what you've been looking at quite a lot, but within your question, who are the people that already had the values that you're putting at the top end, the more pro-social values? Because there's obviously there were some people who had more of those pro-social values going into the experiment and people who had less of them. And how much does that describe the public space that we're living in? And part of my question is coming from my own exploration and talk that I gave at the beginning of this, which is about a phrase that I've heard a lot here, which is taking these psychedelics brings you back to wholeness. So back to wholeness, reintegrating yourself. That's something that is very difficult to do in our growth society, work-driven culture, consumer society. It's the society, the context in which we're living in, that is so broken and that we're trying to heal from. And how much of it, obviously we're trying to drive it from the inside here, but isn't there a danger that if we only talk about what's being driven from the inside and we're not doing the work to change it on the outside? Jules, I think you're addressing this, but I also want to know within what you're doing, who are the people who are already there? What kind of lifestyle do they have? Is there a gender mix in that as well? So in other words, what is the real prospect of change out of this work that you're doing?
Jules, do you want to answer, or does anyone else want to take that?
I'll jump in very quickly on that. I mean, this cohort, to answer part of what Indra was saying there, this cohort, as I showed, is probably quite skewed. It was our first cohort. It's an experimental cohort. It was politically and values-wise fairly skewed towards intrinsic values. We hope to have more diversity in future cohorts, because I think that's going to be really, really important. Otherwise, there's somewhat an element of so what with this sort of thing. Largely in society, what we know from all the values research that's been done right across the world for many decades now. The evidence shows societies are more extrinsically orientated than they could be, and that actually the sort of extrinsic side of ourselves is dialed up, and we dance more towards the extrinsic side of the circumplex than we could do. And as I said, values can shift with dialing up and dialing down certain narratives and stories. And just on the point about the integration that Indra mentioned there, particularly as our program is not looking at the self, it's greater than self type exploration. That point about the context that you go back into being crucial. I mean, classically, you can do a lot of work with people in prison to help reform them or whatever. But if they go back out and hang out with the same people, there's a chance they're gonna reoffend. And so the same sort of context is something we're very conscious of in the integration process. Is when people are going back into their families and their communities, are their families and their communities able to support the journey they're going on through their integration? We don't know the answer to that yet, but it's something we're really keen to explore. Is other than just the personal process of integration, the community that people are in, how can they support that integration process as well? And that's something we're just beginning to explore.
That's a great answer. Thank you, Jules. And I mean, that's the meta question, right? How we change in the larger picture. There's the old, change one person, you change the world. So hopefully ripple effects out, and then it affects the community at large. But yes, that's the challenge. By changing one person, do we begin to change the people around them, the community, and do they do good things and behaviors that ripple effect out? And again, this underscores, you read the press, everyone doesn't have the same experience. It isn't always a return to wholeness. They can be challenging. They can be complicated experiences. And again, we're in the early stages or middle stages now of clinical trials, so we're still exploring. But that's, of course, a big question.
Two things I want to say. One is none of us have all the answers. We have probably more questions ourselves. So this is an ongoing investigation, shall we say. The second thing I want to say is there's a lot of people who have questions. I want you all to be patient and take a deep breath and remember what it is that you have to ask, because there was an order of hands going up. So I see you, I now see you. You're next. I saw you already. You'll be coming. I see you, and I see you. And I think there's also someone over here as well. Correct? Yes? So you will go next. Then you will go. Okay. And then we'll have more. Just a moment. Everybody take a deep breath. Okay. 1 second. 1 second. Please, sir. Hello. Yes.
I'm a neurologist. And I was very happy to hear you emphasize that the research on psychedelics is not supposed to be a shortcut to meaning if our society does not create meaning at all. So it should better be seen as a way to help people that have lost meaning for any reason from the medical point of view on the medical, and it will be a great danger for medicine to want to change, to take the responsibility to create meaning for the society if the society is unable to find it by all the other means that make us human. I have a question, and this is a trivial question. You talked about the mystical experience, and I would like to hear if there's any other, if you have any clue that it has to do with serotonin also, with the agonism on serotonin, or it has to do, we have a clue of any other neurotransmitter that may be a part of the mechanism of the mystical experience. Maybe Professor Dalla is more close to answer that. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Just a quick answer for the second part. Yes, we also know about glutamate acid, and we know that there are some reports that maybe near-death experience and other experiences could be related to the NMDA receptor of the glutamate acid. And of course, all the neurotransmitters in the brain, they are interconnected in a way. So we are influencing serotonin receptors, but this could also influence dopamine and norepinephrine. Probably that's why maybe we also have other effects. And so it's very complicated. But glutamate, I think, is mostly related.
Hello.
I'm going to say with the most respect for all my neuroscientific colleagues, I'm not a neuroscientist, there are brilliant people trying to map the brain. What happens in the brain that changes the mind? But I want to just make sure we always keep on the table to be wary of just biological reductionism. So, oh, this does that. That's important. Let's learn about the brain. It's incredible. But what also we need to keep the eye on is the experience. That experience that's been known to humanity through the arc of history, that happens naturally, it happens with medicines, it appears to be a very important and maybe a central part of consciousness. We'll leave that to a lot of smart people. But that we don't get hung up just on PET scans and all that. That matters. But we have to also maintain some focus on the experience.
Okay, great. We're going to limit the answers to just maybe one or two also. Please.
So thank you very much for a fantastic lecture. I mean, this is really inspiring. I'm Nikos Stefanis, and I'm the chair of the Department of Psychiatry in Athens University. In many ways, I represent the orthodox academic kind of point of view about things. So we have been looking at your work, and it's astounding in the sense that if you look at those D coefficient values that you have, they are just amazing. I'm sure that the academic community has been starting to be convinced. But I was wondering, in your experience, have you encountered any negative experiences? Have been any kickbacks? Has there been any difficulty in conveying the message that you want to convey? And where does that difficulty come from?
So, excellent question, and a multidimensional question, but an important one. First, this does not work for everyone. And in the context of the hype that is being built up in society around this, and the true reason for hope, I think we have a good reason to hope for breakthroughs in psychiatry for many years to come. Yet still people come with what I like to remind people about, which is therapeutic misconception. It's the misconception that since we're studying it, it must work, which is almost never the case. We're almost always studying it because we don't know if it works, or how, or for whom, or under what conditions. And a person comes having read Michael Pollan's book or seen the Netflix series, and they say, finally, doc, I got in, I know I'm going to get cured now. And we have to carefully coach those individuals to know that this may not work for you. And one of the biggest risks that I think that we've truly encountered here is when people get placebo in a study that is not designed to allow them later access to the intervention, or worse yet, when they get psilocybin or MDMA and they don't get better. And there's a great chance for demoralization and further suffering from that. That being said, that's not directly answering your question. I don't think that's what you meant. In terms of the patients who are carefully screened in our carefully controlled clinical trials, I'm not aware of any worsening except in the context of what I just described. And there was a multinational clinical trial that was published by Compass Pathways, in which over 200 people were treated. And in that study, a number of people had increased suicidality after receiving a high dose of psilocybin. There are at least two explanations of that. One is they may have been individuals who didn't get better after the treatment and then felt demoralized. The other is that when you're treating patients with severe depression, the greatest opportunity for suicidality is when they begin to recover and they begin to get agency and arousal, and they can move again. And then that is a very dangerous time, especially for patients with treatment-resistant depression who are suffering as a rule. And so we have to be very careful to be wary of these adverse effects as we're conducting more trials, but also put them in context of the people who are suffering, who are treating. But essentially, given that whole context, I'm not aware of anybody who has gotten worse or has had a prolonged negative outcome that is simply attributable to the drug.
And I'm also under the impression that it also depends on which drug is being, because MDMA is different from psilocybin, which is different from LSD, which is different from ecstasy, from everything. So please.
Because you're also asking, I think, maybe Fred may be a better person to answer this, how the field is, I mean, the reception on a larger level. It's been positive. I mean, FDA is supportive, DEA, the results are the results. However, the hype, we have to be careful, early stages. There's a handful of studies, So positive, good results, received well by, academia, but siga, we're just starting out. Fred, I mean, fair enough? So far accepting. The government's been so supportive. FDA, DEA, all the local IRBs are really supportive. We're doing it carefully. I mean, we're all proud of all the centers in America and in Europe who are doing it. It's being done the right way, but we're just starting out, folks. You should do it. Say that again. Did you hear that?
You heard it here first.
You know who's going to start that? Nikos is going to start that. We're going to help you start it here.
Thank you very much for for this conference. My question is the following, and I'm happy we came back to the effects of these drugs. So in my personal research on whether I should take these drugs or not, I came by a statistic showing that alcohol is in fact much worse at if I had psychosis. If I were to show psychosis, alcohol would be much stronger. Why isn't this known, and why don't we promote this in the media so that people know, you've been drunk, so, you're probably safe. That's my understanding, right? Or am I wrong?
I didn't catch that. You catch that?
So I think the question was, you found some mention in your searches that the effects of psychedelics can be stronger if you're with alcohol?
No. That alcohol itself,
Yes.
as a substance, can be far more harmful in igniting psychosis than a psychedelic medicine.
Yeah, I'll say for certain that alcohol, tobacco, nicotine, the legal drugs are many times very incredibly dangerous. Professor David Nutt at Imperial College has published a couple of different papers basically laying out the relative risks of a variety of drugs, and you'll see that the physiological risk and the mental health risk of psychedelics are incredibly low compared to drugs that we all accept and use every day legally around the world. I think it's a point that he tried to make. I believe it may have been one of the reasons that he was removed from the head office in London. But because it's offensive to some people, because people don't want to see alcohol as a drug of abuse sometimes. It's
Right,
accepted, we
because
all do it. Oh, my aunt drinks a lot of alcohol. She's not she doesn't have a substance use disorder, except we're going to have to face that one day.
And we also saw this in the beginning of cannabis. We saw reefer madness and how it was going to make you go crazy and do all kinds of things, but we know better.
And I don't want to ruin everyone's dinner cocktail tonight, but there's been a big literature this year in 23 on alcohol, just emerging how dangerous it is. So for all our lives, at least in America, I think all throughout Europe, the standards, the folklore was 2 drinks a day for a man, 1 for a woman. It's okay. It's neuroprotective, it's cardioprotective. Since the 1940s, I grew up hearing that from my father, 2 drinks a day, 1 drink for a woman. It was all bullshit. So now we know, it was a big press earlier in the year, that was built on some weird little thing that came out of Hopkins actually in the 1930s, 40s. Not Fred's fault, he wasn't alive then. And it became medical folklore. It's not true. No alcohol level is good or protective. So, exactly. And regarding the final question, public education is everything. Public education.
Hi there, everyone. Thank you.
Just to add this very small, because you said about psychosis in particular, and Professor Stefanis is more, he's an expert on that, but as far as I know, alcohol is not so much connected to psychosis. It's mostly connected to other health issues and mental and health issues. On the other hand, psychedelics have a contradiction for psychosis, right, Fred? They have a contradiction for psychotic people and psychedelic.
They are contraindicated, yes.
Yes, they are contradicted for people with psychotic disorders or history or even family history. So we need to be careful here because alcohol is very dangerous, and of course we know all the dangers for us and for the others, to harm the others, but it's also for other. We need to separate its substance, as you said before, as Gina said.
Thank you very much for all the work that you've done. But a question that came to mind when you were speaking is, it feels like doctors are kind of moving into the realm of priests, and priests seem to be put into the realm of scientific inquiry. And so the question I have is academia structured in the right way currently to really handle the future of this exploration, and how has it been personally for you as a scientist engaging in these kind of end-of-life experiences personally, as to how you had to change your modus operandi and how you treat your patients, and how would you recommend other practitioners who are going into that space, whether they're coming from the medical profession or the religious sector, to be better prepared to help their patients or their constituents?
So in the first question, that's a really important question and a complicated question. And there's a lot of literature now in America. We're not priests. We're not religious professionals. We're academic. We're scientists. So we report the data, and some of the data that you're probably referring to is we map out or discuss the phenomenology of these experiences that Maslow called peak, some people call mystical, but just the scientific data. We're not priests and support. We have a study coming out where we had religious leaders have the medicine to have them tell us what they experienced. But that's important, that we stay in our lane, which we are. The second, the short answer is profoundly, I don't know what the word would be, it's profoundly changed me to watch all these experiences of people dying, and it's helped me to be a better clinician outside of the research dimension, just with people in general who are dying. Because these patients have all been teachers to me. So that's been very helpful. And hopefully in 5-10 years, or at some point, if people become therapists in the States and hopefully in Europe, there'll be platforms where they can have the medicine and legal training models to experience that they can go forward. So I think they're invaluable as teaching tools for some people some of the time. And on the first question, yeah, we'll leave religion to the religious leaders, but it's interesting to see people report these experiences over and over again. Whatever you want to call it, peak. I like Maslow's peak because it gets away from the mystical language. People hear that and think, "What is that?" But they're the same phenomena.
You asked us if academia is going to accept this new science, psychedelic science. Very difficult. I think it will take decades, because psychedelics is not only the enlightenment. Psychedelics reactivates the primordial fear of the human being. We are talking about depression, but there is an answer to this depression, and the answer is fear. And the way the human being is trying to overcome this fear. I would like to read you just a paragraph from Kafkalides' work.
Actually, I'm going to ask if we don't do that, only because it's really important. There's so many people that have questions.
No, because this is...
Yes, you want to read it? Okay, go ahead. Okay.
Very much.
Democracy lives. Go ahead.
So I mentioned, by analyzing Kafkalides' work, that, can you please, that the main point was the main point of his psychoanalytic work, psychedelic research, was to find out if the fetus is feeling, if the fetus has a consciousness. And I mentioned that from Aristotle to Freud, the idea is that the consciousness becomes automatically the moment we are born. Through this psychoanalytic, psychedelic research of Kafkalides and Groff and Lake, hundreds of cases underwent LSD sessions with 100 micrograms of LSD, 8-9 hours sessions. They relived the moment of their birth and the moment within uterus and beyond uterus as well. I mean, this enlightening suddenly is a level of consciousness very far behind. So I read you 6 lines of the development mechanism of mental disturbance as Dr. Kafkalides thought. So, after expulsion birth, many stimulus which contained even the slightest element of rejection could reactivate the memory traces of the rejecting womb and chaotic terror. I mean, there are people who felt in the womb this terror. So after birth, after expulsion birth, a stimulus which can reactivate this terror is the mechanism. The mechanism of the development of mental disturbance is based on a neuronal process which plays a very important role in the way the subject's nervous system is activated by stimuli. And every rejecting stimulus tends to make unconscious primitive terror conscious. And this is the whole thing. I mean, as far as it concerns hundreds of cases who underwent psychedelic sessions of 8, sometimes 10 hours. So we are in front of, or we accept the tabula rasa, or we are entering a new paradigm of believing that consciousness exists in fetus. This is what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
So this is on, yes. I also appreciate all of your presentations. They really expressed your viewpoint very well. I'm, again, fascinated by the management of this information.
Closer to your mouth.
The management of this information. Tony, your presentation, you probably know, the use of psychedelics to treat the fear of death was the very first article that Tina, Gordon Wasson's wife, wrote. This was 70 years ago. So the management of this information is really fascinating to me. All these studies, we know this. Stan Groff, Timothy Leary, we can name many others. The proof that psychedelic drugs can treat alcoholism, their unique benefits in treating a whole range of disorders. And then the thing was shut down. It seems to me, from my point of view, that it's actually the management by the institutions and by the medical profession that has really kind of failed us. And yet we still give this prestige to these institutions that are really not really up for the job. But here's my question, and Jules, your presentation really interested me a great deal. The first book that Aldous Huxley wrote about psychedelic drugs was Brave New World, where he talks about a society in the future where the wealth is controlled by a small number of people at the very top. And the masses of people don't protest because whenever they get a little upset about their predicament, they are ordered by a small group of people to go on these holidays, retreats, and they're given a psychedelic drug which cures them of their unsatisfaction with contemporary reality. So my question is, how is your program different than what Aldous Huxley warned us about? Because you probably know Huxley wrote Brave New World in 1938, but in 1958, he wrote an addendum, Brave New World Revisited, and he said, this is already happening, that LSD is the new soma, and it's being administered by the world controllers, is the phrase that he used. to make people happy. A related question has to do with this very popular program using psychedelic drugs, MDMA, etc., to treat post-traumatic stress disorder in our young men and women who are traumatized by war. I want to know, has anybody decided to use psychedelic drugs to treat PTSD, which stands for pre-traumatic stress disorder? How about if we design some studies and administered these drugs not to the young men and women who are traumatized, acting like human beings, but to the people who are designing these wars? They're the psychopaths. They're the ones that need clinical treatment. They shouldn't be the ones that are permitting these studies, that we're all proud that we're pioneers of this program. That's my question. So,
Can I just answer very quickly? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll be very quick, just very specifically on that point. Why is this different to what the Soma that people were encouraged to take in Brave New World? I think it was called Soma. It's very simple. Psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers. It's the set and the setting, the context, the stories, the things you explore whilst taking the psychedelics, before, after, and whilst, that will mediate where the journey takes you to some large degree. And so that's the key. The container that we're putting around this is what makes that different. I think, if that makes sense.
Anyone else want to comment? Okay. Just speak into it and see. Okay, did you turn it off? No? Okay.
Thanks, first of all, for this nice presentation. I don't know if I should also put a point to the previous question, whether academia is ready for it. Funding is not yet ready for it. We are waiting the funding, most of all. Most of the funding goes to cancer and Alzheimer. So it's very difficult to convince a biologist who has all the tools to answer the questions, to turn from cancer research on 50 years career into suddenly psychedelic assisted psychotherapies. Closing that, I want to come to the panel and ask briefly some questions. We have strong evidence against addictions, addictions on cocaine, heroin, which are increasingly crazily, and this is the impact of the crazy world we live in, the addictions mostly. So I want your review or your opinion about whether we have collaborations with rehabs using psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies on treating addictions. Clinical trials, they have strong evidence. Second, MDMA has been found in clinical trial 3, which has ended already, to treat PTSD. Your opinion as professors on FDA approvals, when do we wait for that? And the last one, summon intervention with Western pharmaceutical practices, Western medicine practices.
Yeah, so I can speak directly to addiction. There's evidence built and demonstrated for the potential for psilocybin to treat patients with tobacco use disorder, alcohol use disorder. There are unpublished data from a clinical trial that have been presented at a number of academic conferences showing potential of treating cocaine use disorder, and ongoing studies across the US and possibly other places, and a series of other substance use disorders. So the field is going strong after that question. I think it's obvious that a residential treatment facility may provide an ideal place to deliver these therapies, and we're working on collaborations of those natures. So that's what I can speak to in terms of that part of your question.
I want to say something for the first point. It's true that we need more funding, of course, but for the brain in general, to understand the brain and then to understand disease and have more treatments. And this is something that we advocate also at the European level. But I don't think we need less funding for Alzheimer's disease, but this is one of the biggest problems in the future. But also maybe psychedelics could be useful for dementia, not to treat dementia, at least to try to I don't know, yes, to
delay it?
Cope with dementia, yes, in a way.
Help it. Okay.
And hopefully Europe and Greece will follow the way of America. When we began, it was a few private philanthropists. It was that way for a while. And some very wealthy, people who really contributed. But slowly but surely, the NIH and the government's getting involved, and will, hopefully take more of a central role. But unfortunately, at the beginning, it was private entities in, I don't know the European landscape, but hopefully, it will happen here in the same way. They're very expensive, by the way. At least in the States, they might be, I don't know the price model here. In America, they're very expensive trials.
So we only have time for one more question. I know that there's still a lot of questions, hands up all over the place. There's someone who had their hand up way before anyone else. They're all the way up at the top there. But before you ask the question, I just want to thank Fred and Andonis and Zephyros and Christina. Thank you so much. And our friend from back in London, thank you so much for joining us as well, all of you. And please.
I want to thank you so much for being here. Even discussing these subjects brings a lot of joy. I want to bring into the attention that some of the tribes, of the native tribes of the world, as referring to us new westernized people as the younger brother. So only the last few years we are discovering these substances and how we can use them with our knowledge to help and cure our westernized problems. But they have been researching and providing the service of these medicinal plants for eons. And they have been providing as a whole plant, and I understand that your part is to test the active substance of the main plants. So I wanted to ask first, how is anybody actually receiving the knowledge of the tradition, as we know that the shamans are doing it or were doing it? So is there any consultation from tribal spiritual leaders? Because spirituality is a part of this. So it's not about only healing depression, but when we were talking about leaving the body or reaching the wholeness, is there any consultation from tribal people? And then how do you perceive the composing ingredients that exist in the plant that surround the active substance? Thank you.
So, second question first. So that's a great question, and it's called the entourage effect. So would the whole mushroom have an impact versus just the psilocybin that's extracted, or would a cannabis plant have more than THC? Fred's probably smarter than me on this one, but I don't think we've compared it head-to-head yet. But we haven't. But it's a great question, and some people in the States are talking about that and trying to determine, would it be different? Is it just the psychoactive agent, or is there more? Is the family of the plant doing more than we know? Excellent question. Regarding the first question, I mean, we all stand upon the shoulders in some ways of all these prior cultures and tribal lineages. LSD is a modern drug, 20th century. The other ones go back, and as far as I know, we have the government teams consulting with that, but a lot of people in the States do have conferences, do consult with. At a big recent Denver event, 12,000 people came. There was so many representations from Native American lineages, and it was important. So, and that shouldn't be lost sight of. These medicines have been used effectively for a long time. You want to add anything?
I just want to acknowledge that there are many different indigenous cultures that have many very different practices, and it's an important point that I'm glad you raised, but I also just want to leave space for the diversity of practices, the diversity of traditions, and also the sensitivity that we not kind of take what any one tradition is telling us and appropriate that if we do learn and receive wisdom, that we acknowledge that and that we give the right respect to that as we move forward.
And reference it and cite it.
There is a Greek society, an Hellenic society of ethnopharmacology, and they are having a meeting here actually in October. And I know that I have been at one of their meetings about cannabis, but I know that they are studying at least the Greek plants in the way that you are describing. So it's maybe interesting to connect. I can bring you in contact.
And also it's a very different experience. It's a very different experience, I think, when you take any kind of a drug in a therapeutic process than when you do it in a ceremonial practice. They're very different experiences altogether. But once again, thank you all so much. Jules, thank you so much for joining us as well. If you have any other questions that you want to ask, folks will be around. Please don't hesitate to continue to ask. Thank you.